Chapter 239. In the end, Lu Xiaoyi didn't embarrass himself. He wasn't the least bit ashamed of being late. If he really changed his escape technique, most of the people here might not be able to keep up with his star escape. This young master was just teasing you. However, his good mood disappeared without a trace after a breath. This was because he discovered two people among the 19 inner sword cultivators. One of them had a pair of phoenix eyes. Who else could it be other than the infant mother, Gong Xiaodai? The other one was dressed in hemp clothes. When he looked over, that person also looked at him with a friendly smile, as if they were old friends. However, they didn't know each other. The reason they were so close was because they had something in common. Taoist Master Yuaning was experienced and knowledgeable. He wasn't the least bit affected by this surprise. He pointed at the huge beast head. "Everyone go in." Without any hesitation, the Foundation establishment cultivators entered one after another. Taoist Master Yuaning sat cross-legged on the ground and focused his mind. His divine sense followed closely into the Nine Palaces realm. Yin Xiao and Gu Huang looked at each other and felt an itch in their hearts. They knew this Taoist master inner sword. He held an idle position in the Thunder Palace and had some friendship with their master. In fact, in the Xinyuan Sword School, the difference between the inner and outer swords wasn't as big as imagined. A mountain couldn't have two tigers unless one was male and the other was female. Since the outer swords had already lost the strength and courage to resist, there was no need to fight over one master and one follower. Especially the higher the realm of cultivators, the more peaceful they were. Once they reached a certain position, many things could be seen clearly. Seeing the two Jin Dan coming over, the Taoist master smiled. "You too. Do you also want to see the situation inside? Don't worry, nothing will happen." Yin Xiao respectfully handed a cigarette to the old Taoist master and lit it. "Martial Uncle Ben Xiao, this is the first time we're in charge of this task. We didn't have any opportunities when we were young and haven't entered the Nine Palaces realm. Why don't you show some mercy and manifest yourself so that the juniors can broaden their horizons?" The old Taoist master took a puff of his cigarette. "Fine, I'll let you two broaden your horizons for the sake of your master. However, your master has a box of good cigarettes. Think of a few for me when we're in the scenery." As he spoke, he took out an object and connected it with his divine sense. Light and shadow floated, and a space was projected in the void. There are dozens of battles in the Nine Palaces realm at the same time. Speaking of which, the Nine Spirits Ancestor and us human cultivators are in charge together. In fact, in terms of spiritual power, how can humans do it? In any case, my Yuaning won't work. Only true monarchs can do it. But how could the Supremes have the time to watch ants fight? Actually, it's not just the true monarchs. Even I, and all of you, are starting to feel sleepy from watching it. Right? Jiuling Jun was in charge of everything in the realm of the Nine Palaces. He was in charge of everything, arranging the matchups, controlling life and death, and judging the results. He was in charge of everything. I was just there to assist him. Jiuling Jun can control all the battles, but I can only see part of it due to the limitations of my cultivation level. Now that I've shown it to you, there's only a small space. As for who you can see, whether it's exciting or not, that's up to the heavens. The two of them were quite lucky. Soon, two cultivators appeared in this space. One of them was a female cultivator, the outer sword cultivator, and the other was an inner swordsman in hemp clothes and a hat. When Gu Huang saw them, he cursed inwardly. His face was outstanding and was immediately noticed by the old Taoist master. Even Yin Xiao, who was beside him, felt it. It wasn't that he wasn't shrewd, but because he saw the two people beside him as his closest friends, he didn't hide it. "What's wrong with you being so flustered?" The old Taoist master was straightforward. Gu Huang was a bit hesitant, but in the end, he couldn't hide it. "It's like this. This Kuan cultivator, Yin Sheng, came from the left Zhou's clear sky. His opponent, the inner sword cultivator, Yin Yun, also came from the clear sky. Perhaps they had some personal relationships when they came to the Five Rings. Yes, it's the things between men and women. When they came to the Five Rings, The inner and outer swords were divided into inner and outer swords. Yin Yun felt that he had some capital and thought that he was the one blessed by the heavens. He came to the Thousand Virtues Peak several times to pester her, but who knew that this female cultivator was stubborn and refused him even more. Because of hatred, Yin Yun once said that one day he would teach this female cultivator a lesson. When they were arguing, I happened to be at the Thousand Virtues Peak, so I knew about it. Martial uncle, you see, with this layer of karma, I'm afraid that there will be emotions involved in the competition. Do you think you should tell Jiu Lingjun not to let them meet? The old Taoist master shook his head. I can't agree to your request. It's not that I'm taking advantage of my seniority, but there are 3 reasons. First, is Jiu Lingjun someone I can tell to move? Not to mention me. Even if Martial Uncle True Lord came, he would also be defeated. Second, cultivators have to adapt to different battle situations. When you go out and meet other cultivators who can't beat you, do you also have to make such a request? Third, since there's a reason, you have to solve it, not delay it or avoid it. The sooner you solve it, the better. If you don't solve it now, are you going to wait until this little bit of enmity accumulates before you solve it? Fourth, in your eyes, is my internal sword lineage so unbearable? Are all of you unreasonable because of your strength? I don't believe that Yin Yin doesn't even have this little bit of magnanimity. Can he turn love into hate like a mortal? Let them fight, we'll just watch. Gu Qi was speechless. Martial uncle, that's 4 reasons. Since the old Taoist master insisted, with their strength and status, they naturally couldn't say anything more. If they did, it wouldn't end well. The old Taoist master was very confident in his internal sword lineage's disciples. In terms of strength, there was nothing to say. However, in terms of character, which group could guarantee that they were all open-minded people? Learning the sword could increase one's combat strength, make them more iron-blooded, more passionate, and more courageous. However, it couldn't change a person's fundamental character. There were narrow-minded, selfish people everywhere. They would use this as a pretext to make a fuss and seek revenge for the smallest grievance. There were such people in the Supreme Sect, the 3 Pure Ones, the Temple of Buddha, and even Xinyuan. There were external swords, but why wasn't there an internal sword? An internal swordsman was a sword pill, not a person's character. However, these words couldn't be said to the old Taoist master, unless they were external sword immortals. This was the cruel reality of the cultivation world. In the image, 2 cultivators were rapidly approaching each other. Needless to say, Yin Yun was an internal sword cultivator and an external sword cultivator. Since when did she need to hide and be careful? What was rare was Yin Shun. Although she was a female cultivator, her sonorous aura wasn't any weaker than a man's. She also faced them face to face. As a woman, she was able to occupy a place among the new external sword cultivators. Naturally, she had her own uniqueness. Her aptitude, talent, diligence, and luck were not lacking in any of these. In particular, she was good at carving sword formations. She displayed the meticulousness of a woman to the fullest. For example, she knew that she couldn't hide her strength when fighting with an internal sword cultivator. Otherwise, wouldn't it be a waste if she was defeated before she could display her true strength? Therefore, 3 flying swords flew out simultaneously. 2 were level 8 flying swords, and 1 was level 9 flying sword. Among the cultivators who had joined the external sword sect for less than 50 years, this was already an extremely rare achievement. For a moment, the sword light whistled and the sword shadows were chaotic. The 2 swordsmen, one from the internal sword cultivator and the other from the external sword cultivator, brazenly attacked each other. Within 10 breaths, they were evenly matched. Chapter 240. The old spiritual master praised. This girl is amazing. It's a pity that she is not an inner sword. Otherwise, she would be a heroine. It's a pity that she can't hold on for long. After 10 breaths, we will know the result. Smoky Puppet's strategy was right, but also wrong. What was right was the method. When fighting with an inner sword, One had to use all their strength at the first moment. They could not use the strategy of attacking later. Otherwise, once they lost the initiative, they would not be able to recover. What was wrong was the strength. Because the external flying sword was a weapon with form and substance, it would consume a lot more magic power than the internal flying sword. This kind of situation could only be reduced infinitely after the flying sword produced a sword spirit. But now it was very fatal. The outer sword could not maintain this intensity of output. If one could not control the enemy during the explosion, the enemy would take advantage of the moment when they were weak. This was a double-edged sword. It depended on one's choice. Now that 10 breaths had passed, Smoky Puppet did not control the opponent. She should slowly stop and find a decent and acceptable way to admit defeat. However, they thought that the old spiritual master's 10 breaths agreement was too much. In their opinion, Smoky Puppet could at least hold on for 10 breaths. In the end, they did not understand the inner swordsman as well as the inner sword spiritual master. Smoky Puppet's character was strong. She did not leave herself any leeway. She would rather collapse than retreat and beg for mercy. This might be her character, or she might want to express something, but Smoky Puppet did not care anymore. With his strength and status, he had a lot of choices for female Taoist companions. For example, he had taken a fancy to the new Smoky Puppet, Mu Kaling, and he was making progress. However, he had a domineering character, and he couldn't tolerate someone openly refusing him, especially under the gazes of everyone. He didn't care about whether he could become Tao companions with this woman who failed to appreciate his kindness. He cared about the fact that she actually dared to slap him in public and make him lose face. Therefore, he could see that this was the woman's final madness. But he wanted to break her in her final madness. He wanted her to understand the difference between the inner and outer swords. Suddenly, there was an explosion. The flying sword's attack speed was even faster. It was so fast that Smoky Puppet, who had already run out of oil, could not block it. Finally, a flying sword pierced through Smoky Puppet's leg. This was intentional, because if he pierced his heart and head, the Nine Palaces World Spirit would automatically determine the outcome of the battle, and he would not be able to carry out his revenge. Piercing the leg was a minor injury. In the cultivation world, such an injury wouldn't affect one's battle. Yin Chang didn't say anything. She had no strength to use her flying sword again, but she still had a sword in her hand. With disheveled hair, the woman wielded her sword and charged towards Yin Yun. In the eyes of the two Jin Dan, this was no different from seeking death. Close combat was a planned and purposeful tactic when one's magic power and spirit were abundant, but it wasn't meant to be used like this. She couldn't even get a foot closer to him. As for Yin Yun, she maintained a distance of 200 zhong and cruelly swung her sword again and again. Even after she blocked a portion of the flying sword with her sword, there were still flying swords that found a gap and pierced through her legs and hands until she could no longer hold the sword in her hand steadily. I admit defeat. Beg me. Yin Yun did not have any protective feelings for the fairer sex. He always believed that a woman was a woman. There is no need to mix too much emotions with her. I won't ask you to become my Tao companion. I won't accept a crazy woman like you. But you have to apologize. Beg me. I'll give you a quick death. From now on, we'll cut off all ties and have nothing to do with each other. Yin Chang's hair was disheveled, and she looked miserable, but she still didn't say a word. Even without her sword, she still had her teeth. She still charged forward without a care, allowing the sharp flying swords to pierce through unimportant parts of her body. A cultivator's body was very tough. Without attacking their vital points, it was impossible to kill them in one strike. But because of this, she had to endure even more, even crueler injuries. Was this the result of the external sword sending his own disciple here to train? Yin Xiao could no longer bear it. Martial uncle, this is too much. Gucci was also indignant. Martial uncle, I'm willing to submit this scene to Thunder Palace. Let Thunder Palace master give an explanation. The old Taoist was furious. Shut up. I don't know that I've done this before. I really like this girl's personality. I've been contacting Jun since the first time he pierced her leg. But Jun ignored me. What the hell is going on? This has never happened before. Why did he ignore me? Why didn't he stop? The old Taoist was still yelling. If he wasn't facing an existence that far surpassed him in both cultivation level and age, he would have long spewed out obscenities. It wasn't his first time hosting the internal and external sword duels, and he had some friendship with Jun. Jun always gave him face when he spoke, but he didn't know why it didn't work this time. He was still trying his best to communicate with his divine sense, but the light projection that showed the situation inside suddenly shattered, turning into a stream of light and disappearing. The two Jean Dan beside him were even more dissatisfied. What? You don't even want to show us the scene of our external sword being tortured to death? Are you going to torture us to the end? Before they could voice out their complaints, the old Taoist master suddenly sat down on the ground and said blankly, "It's over. Something's happened." Yuan Zhao's heart trembled. "Martial uncle, what's wrong? What happened? Could it be that our external swords, yin, chong, shi, shi?" The old Taoist shook his head. "What can happen to her? I've already contacted Jun, and he has already ended the duel. Your female swordsman is recovering in the Nine Palace realm. She's fine." The two Jean Dan didn't believe it. "How can it end just because you said so? Why did you cut off the image at the crucial moment and not show it to us?" However, due to their status, they didn't dare to be rash in front of the inner sword Taoist. Gucci asked, "Since it's over, what's the problem you mentioned?" The old Taoist was very confused. Something happened to Jun. It said that its cultivation suddenly ran out and it could no longer share the inside information of the realm of Nine Palaces with me. From now on, everything in the realm of Nine Palaces will be run by it. No, I have to send this news to the Thunder Palace. The old Taoist turned to leave, but turned back after a few steps. Regarding Yin Yun's torture of her fellow external sword disciples, it was mixed with personal grudges, and her conduct was improper. "I will report this to the Thunder Palace, and you will be the witnesses. I'm telling you now, because I want to tell you that the Inner Sword sect will never be selfish." The old Taoist ran very quickly. At this moment, the two Jean Dan finally understood that something had really happened in the Nine Palace realm. After all, he was a Taoist and wouldn't deliberately deceive them. It was also strange. It had been peaceful for tens of thousands of years, but just because the two of them were in charge, something happened. They were only Jean Dan cultivators, and their level was limited, so they didn't know much. They really didn't understand what the old Taoist meant by something big. Was it just that they couldn't watch? They couldn't participate? Or was it that in the Nine Palace realm, Jun could no longer protect the cultivators' lives? Or was the space of the Nine Palace realm about to collapse, and no one could come out? This old man, he had lived for so long in vain. He couldn't even understand a sentence. Chapter 241. It was raining in the Nine Palaces realm. The rain was endless and pitter-patter. It had been raining ever since Lu Xiaoyi entered the realm. None of this could be seen from the image projected by the old Tao master. Only the cultivators could feel the boundless rain no matter where they were. Lu Xiaoyi hated rain. Back in his previous world, he was at the edge of the Gobi Desert and rarely saw rain. The dry air and wind made him feel much more comfortable than now. But he didn't mind. Was this some kind of simulated environment? It could rain, it could be windy, there could be thunder and lightning. Who knows? This was a very ordinary plain. The wind blew and the grass was low, and no cows or sheep could be seen. There were no mountains, no lakes, and no places to hide. Lu Xiaoyi, who was looking for cover the moment he entered, was very disappointed, but he didn't have the time to complain because a wave of spiritual energy was rapidly moving towards the center of the realm. Seizing the center was the only way for a swordsman to gain the initiative. Forcing the opponent into a corner basically meant victory, because there wasn't enough space to maneuver around. Lu Xiaoyi saw that he had nowhere to hide, and knew that he had to make the first move to gain the upper hand. Seeing that the distance between the two was about 200 feet, he sighed and shot out the Four Seasons sword from the sword sheath. The control of shooting range and distance was the essence of a swordsman's battle. A swordsman who didn't know how to control the distance of the battle wasn't a successful swordsman. At their current stage, everyone had only been in the sect for 10 years. The shooting range of their flying swords was very limited. For example, Yin Yun's maximum controllable shooting range was 250 feet. Thus, he would try his best to control the battle distance at 250 feet. It was impossible for him to attack at 250 feet. Because both parties were moving, he would be out of the shooting range if he moved a little further. Yin Yun had reached the foundation establishment stage several decades ago. Of course, she was not someone Lu Xiaoyi's current opponent could compare with. His current opponent's controllable shooting range was only about 170 meters, so the battle distance should be about 200 meters. 7 years ago, when Lu Xiaoyi launched a sneak attack, his controllable shooting range had exceeded 400 meters. This was the terrifying aspect of a sword spirit. Of course, he wouldn't casually reveal his true strength to others. He had to hide something. That was why he made his move at a distance of 200 feet. It was precisely when his opponent was feeling uncomfortable that the flying sword couldn't reach him. Therefore, he had no choice but to rush forward with all his might in an attempt to close the distance. However, there was a problem here. The inner sword was best at using the sword manipulation technique, but it was impossible to use the sword manipulation technique while in the sword manipulation technique. It had to be switched to the normal sword manipulation technique to be able to use the flying sword. This caused him to fall into a strange cycle. When his opponent's flying sword approached, he had to switch to his normal state to defend himself with his flying sword. But once he lost his flying sword state, he was unable to close the distance between him and his opponent. Take a beating and defend until the seas run dry and the rocks crumble. There was a huge difference between the outer sword and the inner sword. The inner swordsman relied on the sword ball in his Naiwan palace. It used his mana to remove the sword chi and shoot out. It was as if his head was equipped with a machine gun, shooting nonstop. The inner sword's flying sword was more like a sword-shaped chi aura. Therefore, it was invisible and intangible. Once it was shot out, it would be a consumable. It could be shot out again after it ran out. Therefore, it was completely unafraid of the opponent's filth. The only problem was that every time the flying sword was shot out, there was a process of it rushing out from the Naiwan Palace and reaching the opponent. The outer sword's flying sword was more similar to the understanding of mortals. It was real and tangible. Once it flew out, it didn't need to return to the sword box. Instead, it would hover around the opponent's left and right, looking for an opportunity to stab. Therefore, although it wasn't as fast as the inner sword's flying sword, it was closer to the opponent. Therefore, it was hard to say who would be the first to stab the opponent. Lu Xiaoyi, on the other hand, was calm and unruffled. His initiative came from two key choices. The star escape technique, which was not the sword control technique, could guarantee that he could attack without any worries under any circumstances. The spirit of the Four Seasons greatly increased the range of his attack. It was like using a rifle to fight a pistol. His opponent's passivity also came from two aspects. First, apart from the sword control technique, there was no other combat escape technique that could be used. Therefore, although the sword control technique was very cool, it was useless in battle. Second, the normal range of the flying sword was abnormal. When a pistol met a rifle, there was no way to explain things clearly. Right now, the only thing that could support this unlucky inner sword was that the opponent's long-distance sword control would greatly consume his magic power and spirit. As long as he could hold on until that moment, he would be able to get back at him. What he didn't know was that, because of the sword spirit, Lu Xiaoyi's originally very strong magic power and spirit had suffered very little damage. It was completely enough to support him for a very long time. Lu Xiaoyi's only problem was that the Four Seasons attack power was not enough. Because there were too few layers in the sword formation, only a mere 5 layers, and because the fusion between him and the sword spirit of the Four Seasons was far from perfect. Therefore, even though they had the upper hand and were only attacking without taking any hits, they were still unable to turn their advantage into victory. This made him immediately understand where his shortcomings were, and this was also the direction that he had to work hard in the future. As for how to defeat his opponent, he could only use some tricks. In war, tricks were the way to go. It was the same for fighters. Lu Xiaoyi was very talented in this aspect. He didn't know where this ability came from, but as long as he was in a battle, it was as if he could remember countless injuries. For example, right now, he knew that his opponent would definitely be waiting for his magic power and spirit to be depleted rapidly, and then start counterattack. As a person who never cared about fighting fair and square, of course he would follow his opponent's script. The attack power of the Four Seasons was getting weaker and weaker, and the attack frequency was getting lower and lower. It was so weak that the inner swordsman thought that his defensive skills were enough to withstand the Four Seasons attack without being seriously injured. It was no wonder that he was anxious. As an inner swordsman, he couldn't bear to be constantly rubbed against by an outer swordsman. Fortunately, this was the world of 9 palaces and not the outside world. Otherwise, in front of so many elders, he might even commit suicide to apologize. The glorious tradition was a source of motivation, a source of confidence, but it was also a source of pressure, a source of anxiety. He was certain that his opponent was about to exhaust his strength. Not only had the pressure on the Four Seasons been reduced to less than half of what it was at its peak, his cunning opponent was still retreating without leaving a trace. He had originally maintained a distance of 200 feet, but now it was 220 feet. Although the change was small, it was enough to accurately express his opponent's weakness. Therefore, he took advantage of the time difference between his opponent's flying sword and abruptly activated the shadow sword possession. He didn't care about his opponent's flying sword behind him and rushed forward. The shadow sword possession was an internal sword technique that almost every swordsman would practice. It was said that it was the specialty of one of the best swordsmen in Xianyuan when he was in the foundation establishment stage. It was the upgraded version of the sword manipulation technique, the best choice for instantly closing in. At the same time, when he activated the shadow sword possession, Lu Xiaoyi commanded in his mind, and the Four Seasons exploded with more power than normal, shooting towards him. At the same time, he didn't retreat, but advanced instead. Aren't you just trying to get closer and start releasing your flying sword? I'll help you once I'm close enough. Let's just fight in close combat. Chapter 242. Lu Xiaoyi was using 2 moves at once. Either the Four Seasons pierced him from the back, or he cut him from the front. The only difference was how far the inner sword's follower sword could travel. If he got close, he would be pierced. If he got too far, he would be cut. If he stuck his head out, he would be cut, no matter if he retracted his head. The answer was that the follower's sword had not been trained to perfection, so he was pierced. In the next moment, Lu Xiaoyi appeared in front of him with a sword in his hand. What he saw was the inner sword's unwilling and ashamed eyes. Cut me. This was the inner sword's last shout. He could not imagine how he would face his fellow disciples after he left the realm of 9 palaces. He had embarrassed the inner sword sect. Is it that embarrassing to lose to me? Lu Xiaoyi laughed, but in the next moment, he could not laugh anymore. Because the Four Seasons pierced right through his chest, he did not know if his heart was cut in 2. At this moment, fear overcame his fright. Wasn't there still the 9th ancestor? Why didn't he come out when he was about to die? How could he survive in Xianyuan if he had to bear the crime of killing a fellow disciple? In his panic, he did not hold back his words. 9th ancestor, come out and save him. You're trying to take his life. I'm going to report you to the soaring sky palace. He had to get rid of this. In the most central space of the world of 9 palaces, a fatty with black and white fur was crying his heart out. Tears gushed out of his eyes like 2 small fountains. Because of his identity as a realm spirit, his emotions affected the emotions of the entire realm of 9 palaces, so it was raining nonstop. He had been waiting here for tens of thousands of years. Since his master left, he had nowhere else to go except in the 5th ring. Where else could he go? It didn't know how to fight, and it didn't dare to compete with others. Its master had left it with countless troubles and enemies when he was alive. He patted his butt and left, leaving it here to suffer. Thus, it resumed its old business of providing a place for the disciples of the sect to compete. This was only its most basic ability. It originally had many other abilities, but it didn't say anything. It just assumed that it had forgotten. Over the past 10,000 years, it had truly returned to the state that a world spirit should have after being disheartened for 10,000 years. It was careless, dawdling, eating and sleeping, sleeping and eating. It would only occasionally wake up to do a bit of proper business. It was also careless and perfunctory. When a person's heart was gone, they would be like a walking corpse. When a realm spirit's heart was gone, this was a space without life. Just like that, it had slept in a half-awake state for tens of thousands of years. It had once remained motionless and was even scolded by its master for being unimaginably stupid. Yet, just like that, it had coincided with the great Tao of realm spirits. It had slept from yuanying to true monarch. All the great cultivators on the dome were very polite to it. They were really polite, not fake politeness, because of its former owner. Thus, even though they knew that it was slacking off here, no one said half a word. It was just slacking off. It didn't cause trouble, and it didn't want to get involved. This was its attitude towards life. Because in its long life as a world spirit, all the trouble was caused by that bastard of a master. It only knew how to clean up the mess, and it was the kind that couldn't be cleaned up properly. When its master was still around, it would complain every day that it was always in endless troubles and strange dangers. But now it was completely peaceful. It thought that this was the life it had been looking forward to. But reality told it that a life without a heart was even more difficult to endure. This time, it was originally a routine that happened once in a few decades. The reason why Xian Yuan couldn't determine time was because he couldn't be sure when it would wake up. In fact, even if it woke up, it would be in a daze. It would have a head full of anger when it woke up. For this kind of small foundation establishment battle, it could already control it at 20,000 years ago, not to mention that it had become a true monarch 20,000 years later. Until that little fellow walked in. Trashy cultivation, trashy smile, trashy name. It was as if a thunderbolt had exploded in its mind, and as if all the ice and snow on the dome had poured into its heart. It smelled a familiar aura. It was an aura that it would never forget. Thus, it knew that after waiting for tens of thousands of years, trouble had come back. It couldn't control itself, even if it was now a true monarch. Therefore, the battles in the entire Nine Palaces realm seemed a little disorderly, including the battle with Yin Yin. The human perfected person outside ran to report in a panic. In fact, how could there be a problem in the Nine Palaces realm? The problem was that its heart was in a mess. Its heart was in a mess because it wanted to find the answer. Was it you? Did you go too far last time? Did you start over? It was a boundary spirit, not a human, so it wouldn't use the systematic and rigorous things of humans. It relied more on its own instincts, the instincts of a true monarch boundary spirit. It couldn't understand the system of humans, and humans couldn't understand its instincts. After repeated probing and verification, the result was a mixture of worry and joy. The bad news was that this was definitely not its master. Even if its consciousness had not been completely released for the time being and most of its things were sealed, it knew that this was not its master. The good news was that this was something very close to its master. How close was it? A Jew had to admit sourly that it was even closer than a Jew. A Jew was an old man who had started following its master when he was in the Foundation establishment realm. They had more than 8,000 years of experience together. It couldn't compare to this guy. It had a guess, but it couldn't be sure. How did this guy run out at that time? Then, after tens of thousands of years, it returned to Xian Yuan. Its master often scolded it for being stupid, but it didn't think so. It was a little stupid because it was too lazy to think. With its master around, what was the use of thinking? If it was wrong, it would be scolded. If it was right, its master would be jealous and it would be beaten up. It might as well not think. But now it was alone. When it started to think, it actually had a lot of things to think about. It was sure that this guy didn't know anything now. Therefore, There was no point in communicating with him now. A Jew was a true monarch. It was no longer the impatient little foundation establishment realm spirit. During this process, it understood a lot of principles. Not only were they related to itself, but they were also related to human cultivation. It knew that the best way for humans to awaken was to awaken naturally. It shouldn't be nagging in his ear in advance. Therefore, it was best not to appear in front of him now and tell him, "Hey, I'm your long-lost brother, a Jew." But this didn't mean that it couldn't do anything. There were too many things it could do, especially before this guy really grew up. It had already thought it through. Regardless of its previous life, in this life, this kid had to call it Brother Gio. It had to. It just let its imagination run wild. As for what changes would happen on the battlefield, it wasn't within its consideration at all. Would the battle be dangerous? It didn't exist. Back then, when its master was invincible in the universe, a Jew was in charge of logistics, and this kid was in charge of fighting. Even if it was a piece of rotten wood, it had more or less learned a little. How could an ordinary person resist it? As expected, that poor little inner sword was so messed up that it couldn't even return it. It was so depressed that it died. The inner sword had changed to an outer sword. When its master came back, it would see how he would beat its little butt. It wasn't until that kid shouted into the air that a Jew realized its duty. But wasn't this kid too rude? What did he call it? Old Gio? Was this how a foundation establishment realm addressed a true monarch? And he even called himself lousy. Although they had reunited after a long time, a Jew felt that in order to not let him be too presumptuous, it still had to give him a show of strength. Chapter 243. Before Lu Xiaoyi could shout a second time, a ray of clear light descended and wrapped around the body of the inner sword that was rapidly losing life force. The technique was miraculous, and the injuries were healing at a speed visible to the naked eye. At the same time, a solemn voice rang out in the air. The inner sword's smoky sword is severely injured and defeated. You can choose whether you want to fight after you recover. The outer sword's smoky sword is ruthless and merciless. This is a warning. There will be no next time. Lu Xiaoyi was depressed when he heard this. What the hell? Wasn't he supposed to kill by hook or by crook? Wasn't he supposed to train his abilities if he didn't kill for real? Why did Martial Uncle Jean Dan and Zhou Lingjuan's attitudes seem to be different? Then, who should he listen to? He cupped his hands in the air and did not ask any questions. He thought that a big shot like Zhou Lingjun would not tell an ant like him everything. He would just do as he was told. The spiritual energy in the air changed and gradually condensed into a spiritual jade. This was the reward for the winner of the World of Nine Palaces battle. The value of this spiritual jade was very high. It was equivalent to 100 top-grade spiritual stones on the market, but no one was willing to exchange it for it. Everyone was more inclined to use it to replenish their spiritual energy during battle. It was purer, faster, and had no impurities. The more it was so, the more valuable the spiritual jade was. It had already far exceeded the value of the spiritual energy it contained. Lu Xiaoyi carefully kept the spiritual jade in his ring. He was in a good mood. Even though he was not overly greedy for resources, he was intoxicated by the feeling of having money in his pocket. Furthermore, he had fought so hard for it. He had to admit that if it was so easy to earn money, he would not mind a few more battles. The inner swordsman who was at the same level as him was indestructible in the eyes of the outer swordsman. The inner swordsman who was invincible was just SOSO in his eyes. The light rain did not stop. This made Lu Xiaoyi very confused. Why did Zhou Lingjun like the rain so much? In the world of Nine Palaces, there was a certain amount of time to rest after the battle. According to Martial Uncle Jean Dan's introduction, the world of Nine Palaces didn't belong to the Xianyuan clan alone. Instead, it was divided into 5 clans. Every time they entered the world of Nine Palaces, the 5 clans would enter the world of Nine Palaces. That was the true battle of life and death. However, this was something that happened tens of thousands of years ago. Later on, an amazing person appeared in Xianyuan and unified the 5 families' rights to enter the Nine Palace world. Since then, the Nine Palace world became Xuan Yuan's own training ground. The other sects were not willing to enter because everyone knew that the Nine Palace world spirit leaned towards Xin Yuan. If they rashly sent people in, it was impossible to guarantee absolute fairness. Lu Xiaoyi also did not lose much of his mana and spirit. He was now considering whether he should be ruthless if he were to meet an external sword disciple in the next round. He still wanted to keep a low profile. In his opinion, if an internal swordsman lost, he might not spread the news because he would lose face. However, if an external swordsman lost, he would definitely spread the news of his abilities. This was not good. He was very clear that the rafters that stuck out would rot first. With his current strength, he could not withstand the wind and rain for no reason. Even if he were to leave the world of Nine Palaces, he might not be safe. The danger came from the glimpse he had before he entered the world of Nine Palaces. At that time, he saw two familiar faces. Needless to say, they were from the same realm. The grudge came from the moment he lost control of his body. He wanted to grab something to stabilize his body, but it was too slippery. The problem with the tobacco pipe was not dangerous. The real danger came from the other familiar face. Or rather, it could not be considered a familiar face because they had never met before. One was in the distant Third Star region, the other was in the even more distant Azure Sky Big World. However, when they came to the fifth ring, they were familiar faces. This was because there was something in their minds, something of fate. In the world of Nine Palaces, they could not meet it. This was because their ages were different. Lu Xiaoyi was 10 to 20 years old, while the internal swordsman was 20 to 50 years old. They could not pee into the same pot. However, when they left the world of Nine Palaces, everything would be different. He had a feeling that this person would definitely come to him. He would seek to merge the two fates. What if he did not agree? What would happen? Would it be a duel to the death? It was very likely. Xin Yuan did not stop disciples from dueling as long as you had a suitable reason. How could a big melting pot of tens of thousands of people treat each other respectfully and not have any dirty thoughts? The way to solve this would be very swordsman. It would be obvious who would be standing and who would be lying down. Regarding this, he did not have a suitable solution. Should he tell his secret to the sect and hope that the sect would stand up for him? He believed that the sect would stand up for him. However, this was not the way of swordsmen. It was not even the way of a man. This kind of thing could not be discussed with anyone. He had secretly made up his mind. After leaving the world of Nine Palaces, he would strive to train hard for 10 years to raise his strength to another level. Then, he would go out and travel to lure the internal sword out. Then, he would find a hidden place to settle this once and for all. He believed that, just like how he did not want others to know his secret, the internal sword would not easily tell others his secret. Therefore, this was a fair fight. Perhaps from the internal sword's point of view, there was no suspense in the outcome. However, from his point of view, it was hard to say who would win. In order to do this, he had to make the internal sword careless. He could not perform too well in the world of Nine Palaces. This would bring a lot of trouble for no reason. This was his plan. After thinking about it, there did not seem to be any loopholes. Time passed by in his anxious mood. He did not realize that the spiritual vigor around him had almost reached its peak. Or rather, he realized it, but thought that this was the normal state of the world of Nine Palaces. Every small space was like this. This was not right. He did not know which lazy realm spirit was unwilling to waste precious spiritual vigor on these small fries. The spiritual vigor level inside and outside the world of Nine Palaces was almost the same, except for the spiritual vigor around him. It was much stronger than those cultivators who were recovering from serious injuries. Of course, he did not know that a certain fatty with mixed fur was stomping his feet and cursing angrily. This thing did not know how to appreciate favors. After receiving benefits from Jiu Yi, he did not even thank him. Sooner or later, he would teach him a lesson. A Jew's stingy character was just like it was tens of thousands of years ago. The time had come. The world of Nine Palaces had been turned over. Under a Jew's control, it was impossible for there to be a buy. Its current policy was to end the battle quickly and send these guys away. It still had things to do. Since it was selfish, it naturally could not be a completely random match. At least, it had to choose a person's opponent. I'll pick an interesting opponent for you. I want to see if you can learn from boss's skills. Aju laughed foolishly. It felt that this situation was really interesting. In the future, when that kid awakened, it could proudly say, "The happiness of your lower body was all obtained by me." Thus, Lu Xiaoyi suddenly realized that a graceful figure had appeared in his line of sight. He had seen this figure in the mountains for a few months. Chapter 244. It was Yin Dai, also known as Gong Xiao Dai, the mother of the smoking pouch. She was an old acquaintance. Of course, he couldn't attack her right away. He still knew the basic courtesy to a lady. Therefore, he greeted her from a distance and couldn't get too close. It was troublesome when a woman went crazy. "Junior sister Yin Dai, I haven't seen you for many years, and I miss you very much. It's fate that we meet in the world of 9 palaces today. Why don't we sit down and talk about our recent situation? Isn't it fun? Who's the senior brother and who's the junior sister? We'll only know after we fight. Cigarette, but don't tell me you've forgotten what you've done." Yin Dai spoke slowly, but her body was moving at a constant speed without any sign of stopping. Lu Xiaoyi knew that this was her way of getting close to him. She was afraid that she would scare him away if she showed too much eagerness at the beginning. Therefore, he retreated and kept a distance of 2,000 feet from her. "Let's talk nicely. Junior sister, don't shout and kill as soon as you come. You and I are from the same world, and in the entire 3 lower realms, there are only the 2 of us in Xianyuan. We were born from the same root, so why are you so anxious to kill each other?" After saying that, Yindai didn't speak again. She only focused on getting close to him. However, if she didn't use the sword controlling technique, how could she get close to Lu Xiaoyi with the help of the star attraction technique, with an ordinary technique? A funny scene appeared in the space. Lu Xiaoyi was chattering non-stop, while dealing with her in a carefree manner. After Yin Dai circled around in the space a few times, she finally understood that this guy wasn't willing to take the initiative to fight the enemy. If she continued to chase him like this, she wouldn't be able to get any results even if the competition ended. Therefore, she shook her body and turned into a ray of light. She activated the sword controlling technique, and her speed instantly doubled. She was fast, but Lu Xiaoyi was even faster. His star attraction technique seemed to have an extra boost in a place like the world of 9 palaces. This wasn't because of 9 palaces, but because of the structure of the world of 9 palaces. In fact, the space they were in was no longer within the range of the 5 rings. The realm of 9 palaces was also created by the cosmic desolate beast, so it was more like they were in the starry sky. Without the obstruction of the 5 rings' thick atmosphere, Lu Xiaoyi's various star attribute cultivation methods and secret techniques had improved to varying degrees here. It was normal for Yin Dai to not be able to catch up with him. Not to mention her. Even the last person who was slightly stronger than her was beaten up by Lu Xiaoyi. In a certain space, Aju shook her head as she watched. This brat was too useless. He was chased around by a mere Kuin cultivator. He didn't learn any of Boss's true teachings. His strength was not bad among cultivators in his realm, but he was far from the level where his boss had crushed him. The most important thing was that his temperament was too weak, and he wasn't ruthless enough. Yin Dai was depressed when she discovered that she didn't even have a chance to use the sword technique that she had been relying on. He couldn't keep up with the escape technique, and the other party kept avoiding the battle. How was he going to fight this battle? Lu Xiaoyi really didn't know how to fight this battle. He knew very well that with this woman's narrow-mindedness, if he defeated her, he would only attract endless trouble and even hostility. Although he didn't care, in the end, they were from the same hometown and lived under the same sky as Xianyuan. It would be really troublesome if their relationship was too stiff. He didn't want to lose because this woman definitely wanted to stab him with her sword to vent her hatred. He was afraid of pain. He also couldn't quickly crush her. Although his escape technique was a level higher, he might not be much stronger if he really faced her with a flying sword. Therefore, other than running, there didn't seem to be any other effective method. He should have paid her a visit earlier and explained things clearly. At worst, he could have just let her catch him and bring him back. What was the big deal? It was awkward to meet up with such a strong victory, as if they were enemies. In fact, it was just a trivial matter. What was the big deal? Yendai's imperial sword technique was a little cautious at the beginning, but she gradually let go and finally went all out. Other than speed, she didn't consider anything else. She didn't consider whether the opponent would set a trap, whether he would suddenly counterattack, or whether he would suddenly attack. She only knew that this hateful guy had made up his mind not to fight back, so she unscrupulously used her speed to the extreme. There were even several times when she put herself in extremely dangerous situations. A Jew was laughing so hard that she was swaying back and forth. Lu Xiaoyi was also having a hard time hiding below. If this was an open space, this crazy woman's actions would be completely meaningless. However, this was a closed space with a diameter of several thousand feet. Such a narrow space reduced the difference in speed between the two sides by a lot, especially when the crazy woman didn't care about anything else. Although he was very alert, it was very difficult to keep the distance between the two sides at more than 2,000 feet in this kind of situation. There were always accidents and sudden changes in direction. There were several times when he almost entered the range of her flying sword. This was more tiring than killing a person. Lu Xiaoyi lamented. He realized that he had made two mistakes. One was that he shouldn't have competed with her in speed and dodging. He should have subdued her in battle, the gentler kind. The second mistake was even more fatal. It was his endless explanation. He explained that he didn't do it on purpose. He explained that he never had second thoughts. He explained that he promised to stay far away from her in the future. He understood a little bit. Therefore, he took advantage of this crazy woman's exposed weakness again. This time, when the shape-shifting sword came after her, he didn't escape, but rushed back. Of course, this kind of situation wouldn't happen under normal circumstances. Yendai wasn't stupid enough to use this kind of close-range secret technique so rashly. However, it wasn't normal now. The serious fight had already degenerated into a farce of a female villager chasing after a male villager. Therefore, he had no scruples at all. By the time Yendai reacted, her opponent had already rushed in front of her. However, she was still in a state of rigidity after using the fatal technique. She could only look at this guy, huh? He didn't wave his sword. He didn't even draw his sword. He just went around her back, hugged her, and sealed her acupuncture points. His hands tightly held her body from behind, including her arms. A voice rang beside her ear. It was a little itchy. Stop fooling around. All right, I admit it. In the Tsone Mountain Range, I had bad intentions. I kept secretly watching you walk, sit in the car, and feed the baby. On the way to Chaoguang, I killed someone to replace you because you were already chosen by the fifth ring. When we finally landed at the fifth ring, I did want to grab you. I just wanted to help you up, but I couldn't control myself, so my hand slipped. I admit that I did it on purpose. Stop fooling around. This place is inexplicably dangerous. With an internal sword like you as my backer, it will be easier for me to survive outside in the future. If you have any inconveniences in the future, you can also look for me. Let's stop here and consider a draw. The woman slowly stopped struggling and calmed down. However, she still didn't speak much. Let me go. Lu Xiaoyi didn't insist. Fine, you can't use this opportunity to launch a sneak attack. He reached out and unsealed Yendai's acupuncture points. At the same time, he suddenly jumped back as fast as lightning. He only relaxed after jumping 200 feet away. Fortunately, the crazy woman didn't go crazy. Yendai stood in the air. She had a beautiful figure, and her Taoist robe couldn't hide the fatal attraction she exuded. She smoothed her long hair and said softly, "If you have an idea, just say it. You shouldn't lie to me. However, I can't promise you now. In the fifth ring, cultivation is more important." Lu Xiaoyi couldn't help but curse in his heart. What kind of person is this? I don't want to listen to the truth. I'm willing to listen to these boring, flowery words. She's really sick. She's also a pervert. Chapter 245. P.S. Aju's character prototype is out. If it's convenient, please give it a like. Aju didn't have it easy either. Now that she had become a supreme, the spiritual opportunity was useless. She had to suck in monthly votes instead. In a certain space, the fatty with mixed hair curled its lips. This human was too complicated. It didn't know who was lying to whom, but it was a stingy person. A draw? Then how should the spiritual jade be divided? It was impossible to give both of them. It wouldn't give either of them. In any case, it felt that its previous boss had never relied on resources. Now that it was this kid, it should be the same, right? Boss once said that to achieve great things, one must first exhaust one's muscles and bones, starve one's skin, and exhaust one's body. This kid didn't feel any pressure when fighting against someone of this level. Aju was still very responsible. Although it was a little stingy, it was still very responsible if it didn't have spiritual opportunity. It came to the Jiugong to train its ability. If the opponent's strength wasn't enough, this kind of training wouldn't achieve its goal. Therefore, it needed to arrange a few strong opponents for him. It looked at the 20 to 50-year-old inner swordsman. Among them, there was a fierce and brutal cultivator in hemp clothes and a hat. Well, it seemed to be someone called Yin, passing smoke in clouds. Look at the name you gave. When it followed Boss, it spent a lot of time studying the names of the opponents who died at the hands of Boss. It found that many of them had names that were wrong. So this one, as for Xuanyuan's rule that cultivators couldn't challenge people a higher level, it didn't care about it at all. Boss said that rules were meant to be broken. It only depended on whether the time was right or not. Lu Xiaoyi was a little disappointed that he didn't get the spiritual jade, but he couldn't say anything. This was his own choice. Yin Dai was cultivating in the distance. There was a little awkwardness between the two of them. There might have been some misunderstanding, but fortunately, the matter was finally resolved. With Yin Dai's charm, there would be many suitors in Xianyuan in the future. It had nothing to do with him. It was fine as long as they didn't become enemies. Lu Xiaoyi was a nostalgic person. They were companions who came out together. He couldn't cut off all the paths, right? Several hours later, he flipped through the realm again. When he thought of the next spiritual jade, he felt a little excited. However, he did not expect that someone was secretly framing him. Moreover, it was for his own good. On Wengguang Peak, the old Taoist master left in a hurry and returned in a hurry. Facing the two Jin Dan's expectant faces, the old Taoist master sighed. I've already contacted perfected monarch, Le Feng. He asked Jiu Lingjun directly, so it shouldn't be a big deal. It's just that he can't appear, so outsiders can't use their divine senses to penetrate the Nine Palaces realm. However, everything in the world of Nine Palaces was still within Jiu Lingjun's control. Nothing would go wrong. However, Jiu Lingjun didn't want to announce the results this time. He was alone, and we weren't there to help him. It was hard to say. Actually, results and whatnot aren't important. The main thing is that we have a platform to train everyone's abilities. As for who wins and who loses, we all know in our hearts. Those who are motivated will naturally know shame. It doesn't matter what you say. The two Jin Dan were speechless. What was going on? The great Jiu Lingjun, a realm spirit that had lived for tens of thousands of years, would actually make such a low-level mistake. Gucci was somewhat suspicious. Martial uncle, if there's no one watching, nothing will happen inside, right? Could it be that Jiu Lingjun has his own ideas? At his cultivation level, his understanding of an existence like Jiu Lingjun was still superficial. Therefore, he didn't respect him too much in guessing. However, it was precisely because the ignorant were fearless that they were closer to the truth. The old Taoist master reprimanded, "Don't talk nonsense. What kind of existence is Jiu Lingjun? Anyone can do something harmful to Xianyuan, but it's impossible for him to do so. Gucci, it's good that you're meticulous, but you can't make wild guesses. Be careful of your words." Yun Shao hesitated. Martial uncle, our external sword, that Yin Chung, the old Taoist master sighed. "Don't worry, she's fine." Jiu Lingjun said it himself. "I've already reported Yin Yun's actions to perfected monarch Le Feng. I reckon there will be punishment. After that, perfected monarch Lu Feng may ask you to verify it. You must be mentally prepared. Yin Xiao and Gu Qi bowed to the old Taoist master. It had to be said that these old Taoist masters really regarded both the internal and external swords as one. It was also because of the existence of this group of people that Xian Yuan was able to remain united for tens of thousands of years and didn't fall apart because of different cultivation directions. Gu Qi's worries were gone, but his curiosity was still burning. Martial uncle, does a situation like today happen often? The old Taoist master shook his head. I've lived for 900 years, and this is the first time such a situation has happened. Logically speaking, it shouldn't be possible. Zhou Lingjun was able to perfectly control the realm of the 9 palaces tens of thousands of years ago. At that time, he wasn't at his current level. It doesn't make sense that his ability would return now that his realm has increased. It's really puzzling. After thinking for a while, he sighed again. Nothing will happen, right? The 2 Jin Dan beside him also became nervous for no reason. This was a hilly area, and the overall size of the space was no different from before. It was as if in the realm of the 9 palaces, every space was like a beehive with the same size and specifications. The only difference was the specific environment, but there weren't any tall mountains or precipitous ridges because this kind of space couldn't fit. Lu Xiaoyi flew forward leisurely, without a trace of pressure in his heart. This was the benefit of victory. He understood his opponent and understood himself, and this was how confidence was built little by little. When he saw the figure in the distance, his hair stood on end, and he couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. Hemp clothes and hat, flying over. What the F***CK, is this a mistake? His opponent was clearly at the level of foundation establishment for more than 20 years. How could he fight against a 10-year foundation establishment? But Lu Xiaoyi had a good point, and that was when something really happened. He didn't make a fuss, nor did he blame anyone. He was very clear that this wasn't something that could be solved by shouting a few words. Wouldn't existence like Zhou Lingjun make a mistake? Impossible. So since it appeared, there must be an internal reason, and it wasn't something that could be changed by shouting a few words. Would this cultivator in hemp clothes and a hat give up on seizing his fate? Impossible. This was a heaven-sent opportunity, and only a fool would give it up. Similarly, it wasn't something that could be solved by begging for mercy. So, he had no other choice but to fight. Since he had to fight, what was the point of wasting words? But just because he didn't want to waste words didn't mean that his opponent didn't want to waste words either. 500 feet away, the sword in hemp clothes stopped and spoke in a clear voice. I am Yin Yun. According to seniority, you should call me senior brother. I wonder if junior brother is willing to reveal his Dharma name? P.S. Supporting a Jew's character picture is out. Everyone go and give it a like. A Jew didn't have it easy. Now that he became a true monarch, he no longer needed to consume spirit machines. He now relied on monthly votes to grow. Lu Xiaoyi sucked in a breath, and his mood calmed down. Before a battle, all worries were thrown to the back of his mind. This was a good habit. Cigarette, but greets senior brother. Yin wasn't surprised by his laughable name at all, or it could be said that his attention wasn't on these details at all, and in an even more important place. So, junior brother cigarette, but I'll be honest. You and I shouldn't have met here. Our ranks don't match. But since Zhou Lingjun arranged it this way, whether it was by chance or on purpose, I can only say that this is the will of the heavens. Don't blame me. This is something that I can't control. A man's wealth is his own ruin. Since we've met, settling it here is actually the best thing to do. At least compared to outside, junior brother's life won't be in danger. Chapter 246. This was a seemingly polite threat. What he meant was that because Zhou Lingjun was in the realm of 9 palaces, he could still keep his life if he obediently handed over the group of luck in his sea of consciousness. As for the repercussions of losing the group of luck, that was up to fate. If he still wanted to resist stubbornly here, even if he was lucky enough to succeed, he would not be able to avoid being hunted down when he got out. At that time, his life would not be up to him anymore. Even someone as rough as a Jew could hear something unusual from it. She wondered if she had caused trouble with her arrangement. However, he did not want to change it for the time being. In the realm of 9 palaces, he was a god. No one could do anything to him. Who would win or lose, who would live or die, was up to him. Therefore, he had to take a clear look first. Lu Xiaoyi could of course understand. He also finally understood what the so-called senior and junior brother relationship was. In front of the fragments of fate, they were nothing. This also made him heave a sigh of relief. Otherwise, when he made his move, his hands and feet would be tied. Now, things had become simple. Thank you for your kindness, senior brother. Since senior brother wants something, I should not refuse. However, since we are in the realm of 9 palaces, you have to give me something to convince me, right? Otherwise, when I think about it later, I won't even struggle. I'm afraid I will lose my Tao heart. Yin Yun laughed disdainfully. I knew it. Do you know why your external sword is so weak? It's because your strength and confidence do not match. I've taught you for tens of thousands of years, but you still don't understand. Do you really think that just because you cultivate in the dome, you're all swordsmen? Without saying anything, he leaped forward. As expected of a swordsman who had built his foundation for decades, he was very experienced. He did not use the imperial sword technique. Instead, he used a special combat escape technique. It should belong to one of the 5 elements escape techniques, or more. The speed was very fast. In Lu Xiaoyi's eyes, it was not inferior to his starlight guidance. This was a real internal sword with a complete system. It was different from those rookies who had only cultivated for 10 years, and most of their systems were not complete. With just this move, Lu Xiaoyi's escape technique, which had been advantageous in the previous battle, had lost its advantage. He was about to face a severe test. He also rushed forward. At the same time, the 4 seasons were unleashed. The swordsman's ability to snatch the center was a valuable experience that had been passed down for thousands of years. He hadn't snatched it before because there was a clear gap between his strength and his opponents, and he could handle it with ease. Now he was snatching it because he wasn't confident, so he couldn't lose the initiative, momentum, and position. Facing different opponents, one must know clearly what to do and what not to do. Lu Xiaoyi was very clear that he had to treat this battle as a blitzkrieg. There was a huge difference between 10 years of foundation establishment and dozens of years of foundation establishment. It was so big that he didn't have the qualifications to waste time with others. There was a huge difference in the thickness of his magic power and a huge difference in the completeness of his system. As long as the battle dragged on for a little longer, he would undoubtedly lose. He didn't have enough means to achieve enough tactical changes, and he didn't have enough magic power to support the huge consumption of these changes. This was the reason why Xinyuan Sword School divided the foundation establishment into 3 levels. A 50-year-old foundation establishment cultivator could basically reach the late or peak of transcendence energy, while a 10-year-old foundation establishment cultivator, like Lu Xiaoyi, was just about to enter the middle stage. There was no comparison. Moreover, he didn't have enough time to delve into more sword techniques. Therefore, Lu Xiaoyi knew that he could only fight with all his might, and fight with all his might for tactical changes. If he failed, he could change the environment and escape. The distance between the two of them was 500 feet. When Yin Yun started to move, Lu Xiaoyi had already shot out his flying sword. Just this range alone was enough to give Yin Yun a fright. His maximum shooting range was only about 250 feet, and the combat distance was even shorter. Then, how did this foundation establishment rookie accomplish this? There were 2 possibilities. First, it was a bluff. Once an external flying sword left its sheath, it didn't need to be recalled. Therefore, some swordsmen liked to release their flying sword in advance to intimidate the opponent. They would first circle around and wait for the opponent to approach before slashing. Second, it was true that he had the strength, so this possibility wasn't big. However, just like how his 5-element escape had surprised Lu Xiaoyi's flying sword had also exceeded his expectations. After the 4 seasons sword left its sheath, it didn't circle around at all. Instead, it slashed straight, causing Yin Yun's heart to sink. He knew that he had underestimated his opponent. How could someone who had the help of fate be ordinary? However, he was still confident. Confidence came from the fact that his internal sword had suppressed external swords for tens of thousands of years. His eyes were sharp, and his sword was fast. In front of the Four Seasons sword, he quickly shot out his flying sword to block it. Indeed, as he expected, his opponent's flying sword was far away, but its power was very limited. He only needed 4 or 5 flying swords to block his opponent's physical flying sword, and he was an internal sword expert who could slash 10 times in a breath. All of this happened in an instant. Lu Xiaoyi began to attack when he was less than 500 feet away. When the Four Seasons sword reached Yin Yun, the distance between them had already shrunk to 300 feet. When Yin Yun blocked the Four Seasons sword with his flying sword, the distance between them was already close to 200 feet. Yin Yun displayed the power of 10 swords in a breath. When he blocked his opponent's flying sword, the remaining 4 or 5 swords were already shooting towards Lu Xiaoyi. In his plan, this rookie should have another flying sword. Next, both sides would attack and defend against each other. At a distance of 200 feet, they would see who could defend more stably and attack more fiercely. He was confident that he could disrupt his opponent's rhythm within 10 breaths. However, his opponent didn't shoot out a second flying sword to defend. Instead, his opponent appeared in front of him in an instant and slashed down with a long sword. Lu Xiaoyi indeed had a second flying sword. However, it was the 10 strikes decisive city that hadn't been fully formed. Only 5 layers of the sword formation were engraved on it, so it couldn't display the power of the 10 strikes decisive city. Therefore, he wouldn't choose to exchange blows at a distance of 200 feet. His goal was that the Four Seasons sword was already far behind Yin Yun, so he could use the heaven-measuring sword ruler. At the most crucial moment, he believed that he could get close to his opponent. Yin Yun was very surprised, but he didn't escape. His system was once the system of the greatest internal swordsman in Xianyuan. The core of this system was that he didn't fear close combat. His right hand flashed, and a long sword appeared in his hand. Then, he swung it upwards and slashed at his opponent more than 10 times. Moreover, it was as if they had a tacit understanding of each other's minds. He used the soul-shaking stab technique, while his opponent used the soul-fighting technique. Almost in an instant, Lu Xiaoyi's trump cards were all used up. The Four Seasons sword ruler hadn't returned yet. The heaven-measuring sword ruler, the sword in close combat, the soul-fighting technique, these were all he had. When they passed each other, the sword couldn't reach him. Both of them chose to release their flying swords at the most dangerous close combat. Releasing a flying sword at close combat was a swordsman's biggest taboo. Within a distance of less than 10 feet, it meant that both sides had no chance to dodge or block. Whoever's sword was faster would be the first to pierce through. Yin Yun didn't lack the courage to fight for his life. He also understood that if they were both internal swords, it would be hard to say who would pierce through who. However, if they were external swords, the formless internal flying sword would definitely be faster than the tangible external flying sword. Chapter 247. Lu Xiaoyi used the 10 swords decisive city. He had no other choice but to use his sword, and the Four Seasons sword was too late. All of his trump cards were used in an instant without any backup. This was the predicament of a 10-year foundation establishment cultivator. He knew that the inner flying sword was definitely faster than the outer flying sword, because it was formless and intangible, because it didn't need the outer flying sword, which needed a certain amount of time to activate. Even if the activation time was very short, it wouldn't be obvious when the flying sword was thousands of feet away. But the distance between them was less than 10 feet. Only then would they pass each other. With the sword in hand, he wouldn't be able to reach the other. The 10 swords pierced the chest, and the inner flying sword attacked the brain. If there was a slow-motion replay, it would show that when Yin Yun's flying sword was about to pierce through Lu Xiaoyi's head, the 10 swords had only flown halfway. If everything went as expected, Lu Xiaoyi would instantly lose control of the flying sword after his head was penetrated. But the inertia would make the flying sword fly down. Then, the flying sword that had lost control would lose its sharpness under the opponent's physical skills. It would turn from a fatal blow to a small wound. A Jew was a little hesitant. It had been hesitating its whole life, especially during a battle. This wasn't its area of expertise. If it interfered, things would become very simple. But it had already lost the meaning of training. It couldn't stay by this little guy's side forever. Outside of the Nine Palaces world, he wasn't as strong as the legends said. If it didn't interfere, there might be an irreparable accident. Even if it was a supreme-level boundary spirit, some injuries were irreparable. For example, the brain. It could mend the body, but it couldn't mend the mind. Therefore, in all the battles over the past 10,000 years, it would immediately stop any injuries to the head. But this time, its reaction was a little slow, because it was hesitating, wavering between ensuring safety and believing in this kid's fighting talent. When the two sides were fighting at close range, this kind of hesitation was very fatal. Lu Xiaoyi didn't dodge. This wasn't gentlemanly, but in such a short distance, his reaction wasn't as fast as the flying sword. He only focused on Yin Yun's head. His Naiwen Palace seemed to want to see through the opponent's skull and go deep inside to find the sword pill. He focused all of his spirit and willpower into his eyes. He was like an invincible king who was watching his subjects silently. In Yin Yun's perception, he had still struck out with his sword. It was no different from the tens of millions of times he had struck out with his sword. The sword spirit would never deceive him. But this time it was truly different. The flying sword that the sword pill produced only looked like a flying sword in its normal state. But under his opponent's gaze, when the flying sword collided with his head, it was as though a beauty was fanning herself while her master was sleeping, bringing about a gentle breeze. It was slightly cool, and then dispersed in all directions. The next moment, Yin Yun felt a sharp pain in her chest. Although 10 strikes Ju only had 5 layers of sword formation, it was still a flying sword, not a kitchen knife. Even at such a short distance, it was still a fatal danger to cultivators. Actually lost? How'd he lose? He was defeated by an accidental mistake that he had never made in the tens of thousands of sword strikes since he had his own sword pill. One mistake, and he lost his life? Yin Yun couldn't understand. He didn't believe that his sword pill would take the initiative to make a mistake. His opponent must have used some method to affect his sword pill. But the sword pill was the purest killing weapon in the cultivation world of the universe. How could it be so easily affected by his opponent? If it could be affected, would it still be a sword pill? He saw with his own eyes that the little swordsman came to his side and took away his group of luck while he was weak. In his heart, it was as though the whole world, the whole universe had abandoned him. A sense of brutality surged in his heart. He decided that when he got out of the Nine Palaces world, he would find a chance to kill him. He didn't need to find any excuses, and he didn't need to wait. He would directly challenge him to death. He believed that he could make a mistake once, but he wouldn't make a mistake twice. The Nine Palaces world wasn't the end. With Jiu Lingjun around, there would be no deaths. He originally wanted to take this opportunity to take away the luck of this cigarette, and he wouldn't have to bear the crime of harming his fellow disciples. It could be considered as giving this cigarette, but a way out. But he didn't expect this person to be so unappreciative. Then he would use a real cultivator's method to solve this. Although he felt his life draining away, Yin Yun was still laughing coldly. He had already decided the life and death of this cigarette, but after they got out of the Nine Palaces world, he wasn't worried about any accidents. He had already checked the brush of his cigarette, but clearly, it was the ability of a normal 10-year foundation building swordsman. There was nothing special about it, except that the flying sword had a long range. Just as he expected, a ray of clear light descended and enveloped him. He could feel his life force rapidly recovering. He could only smile as he looked at the little sword cultivator who had taken away his most precious item. The spiritual vigor in the space gathered and condensed into another spiritual jade, which was kept by the cigarette, but he didn't care. He would let him return it the same way he got it. Then, light and shadow flashed. That was the characteristic of the realm crossing. This was a small accident. Theoretically, they still needed to stay in this space for a few more hours to recuperate or recover. The realm crossing this time was a little too fast. Their real battle only took a few dozen breaths, right? But it didn't matter. It didn't affect the overall situation. Yin Yin was not disappointed when he saw the cigarette, but being flipped away. Don't worry. He had already lost interest in killing this person in the Nine Palaces world. What was the point of killing him? Everything would wait until they got out. As he thought, he felt the clear light surrounding him getting brighter and brighter. The spiritual vigor was getting denser and denser. This allowed his injuries to recover faster and faster. Jiu Lingjun was really a responsible elder. He was so dedicated to small foundation building cultivators like them. But he quickly stopped this thought, because the spiritual vigor couldn't be stopped. It was getting denser and denser. It was no longer something a foundation-building cultivator could bear. Spiritual vigor was a good thing, but it depended on the situation. If you suddenly gave a mortal a mouthful of spiritual vigor, it wasn't kindness, but poison. This was also the case for cultivators. Foundation establishment cultivators had a level they could accept. If you were to pour in the highest level of spirit essence, such as jade clarity or violet clarity spirit essence, then you would not be saving people, you would be killing them. Lingjun, I'm weak now. Yin Yun's shout was blocked by the spiritual vigor. As a foundation-building cultivator, he had to bear the spiritual vigor that only a perfected cultivator could bear. The result could be imagined. In a certain space, the fatty with mixed fur was very distressed about the consumption of spiritual vigor. He saw a cloud of blood mist in the clear light. There was no sign of life, so he quickly retracted the spiritual vigor. This person couldn't be left alive. It would affect the little guy's growth. Although the little guy always had a way to get through difficulties, if it happened outside the Nine Palaces world, a Jew would be powerless. As for the rules of Xianyuan, it had nothing to do with it. It wasn't here because of its loyalty to Xianyuan Sword School, but because of something else. After being with someone for a long time, it would naturally be assimilated. To a Jew, there was no loyalty to any orthodoxy, and there was no sense of good or evil. In its cognitive sequence, it was a simple top-down list. Master, close person or spirit, swordsman, and others. Chapter 248. Lu Xiaoyi was also curious. How to get crossed over? However, this Jiuling Jun might have some problems with his brain, so it was not strange that he did things incoherently. However, he did not have time to think about the world of Nine Palaces, because there was an even bigger problem in front of him. He suddenly realized that the 10 dashes Ju flying sword had given birth to a sword spirit in an instant. Of course, this was good news that couldn't be any better. However, the problem was, how did it give birth to a sword spirit? He clearly knew that less than 15 minutes ago, when he used the Ju City sword to kill people, this flying sword did not have a sword spirit and was still lifeless. How did it give birth to a sword spirit in the blink of an eye? This change almost overturned all of his previous judgments about the conditions to give birth to a sword spirit. Almost all of his previous judgments were wrong. It had nothing to do with the materials. It had nothing to do with the sword technique. It had nothing to do with the pearl. Of course, it had nothing to do with the world of Nine Palaces. This was because when the Four Seasons gave birth to sword spirits, he had not even heard of the world of Nine Palaces. He was quick-witted and quickly found a common point before the birth of a sword spirit. Both of them were after killing people. F***CK. Could it be that the real reason for the birth of a sword spirit was to kill a person to give birth to a sword spirit? However, that bastard Yin Yun did not seem to be dead. This was such a mess that it gave him a headache. He was now making use of the time to familiarize himself with the 10 dashes Ju flying sword. 2 flying swords with sword spirits were a qualitative improvement to his fighting power. This meant that he could balance both attack and defense at the same time, which meant that he had more tactical options. He had to familiarize himself with it as soon as possible, because this Jiuling Jun was too unreliable. He had mixed up his 10-year foundation establishment with someone else's 10-year foundation establishment. He did not know if the whole world of 9 palaces was in chaos, or if he was the only one who encountered this situation. Should he complain to the sect after he left? Just as he was getting excited, a strange thing jumped out from afar. It looked like a bear, but did not look like one. It had black and white fur, short legs, a round belly, a big face, and a smile like a flower. Lu Xiaoyi was a little confused. When he came in, he did not see any demons participating in this competition. Where did this thing come from? Was it his opponent this time? Or was it a bad guy who sneaked in? Or perhaps some swordsman spirit pet was left here? The mixed-furred demon swaggered over. His words were very clear, and he spoke very fluently. I am a realm spirit here. I know you don't believe me, but you can see what I'm capable of next. The fatty pointed at the space. This is a grassland now. I can change it to a sand dune. Almost as he spoke, the spiritual opportunity in the space changed, and the 5 elements dislocated. Almost instantly, a sand dune was formed, and the grassland from before disappeared. It can also become a lake. The sand particles as small as his feet instantly turned into water droplets, and a lake appeared. Or a forest. Lu Xiaoyi was dumbstruck. This was something that was impossible for him to see at the level he was in contact with. In fact, it was also his dream. However, all of this was as easy as flipping one's hand for a boundary spirit. He could understand. Who said that a boundary spirit had to be in human form? Also, it was impossible for anyone to sneak in. All right, there's no need to change anymore. I believe you. Are you the legendary Jiuling Jun? The fatty with mixed fur clasped his hands behind his back, enjoying the adoring gaze of this little cultivator. Of course. However, it's disrespectful for a junior like you to call me Jiuling Jun. Today, I'm in a good mood, so you can call me Grandpa Jio. Lu Xiaoyi instinctively felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what exactly was wrong. The fatty with mixed fur saw his hesitation and pretended to be angry. Why? I'm an existence that has lived for tens of thousands of years. Is it wrong for a human with only a few decades of lifespan to call me Grandpa? Lu Xiaoyi thought that it was right. This boundary spirit was older than Xin Yuan, so it wasn't too much to call him Grandpa. Most of the people in Xin Yuan didn't even have the chance to call him that. Although he thought so in his heart, when he called him that, he still felt that it was lacking in weight. Grandpa Jio, you came to find me. Is this the procedure that every cultivator who comes in has? Or are you specifically looking for me? I have to explain to you. There's actually no deep hatred between me and that yin-yin. I just used a special method to steal some of his fate. You don't know, but the two of us are different from others. We can see each other's fate. If I don't steal his, he will steal mine. There's no other way. Is he all right? It's just a little bit of fate. He shouldn't have become an idiot, right? With you, Lord Jio, around, this little injury is easy to deal with. Lu Xiaoyi was 90% telling the truth and 10% lying. He knew very well in his heart that 80 foundation building cultivators came in. How could someone like Jiuling Jun meet them one by one? Not to mention a perfected cultivator like him, even a Gene Dam master would be too lazy to teach them one by one. Therefore, there must be a reason. It must be deliberate. He counted his actions in detail. Other than absorbing Misty Cloud's luck, everything else was normal and well-behaved. Hence, the problem must lie in the plundering of luck. In his opinion, Jiuling Jun, who was a perfected cultivator, was a far cry from him. Furthermore, he was in Jiuling Jun's territory. It was impossible that Jiuling Jun did not notice something. Instead of being forced out and leaving a bad impression, it was better to take the initiative to confess. He and a Jew didn't step on the same spot, but it didn't mean that they couldn't reach some kind of tacit understanding. A Jew also had its own thoughts. Its thoughts weren't about the death of cultivators or the stealing of fate. These were all trivial matters. Its problem was, how could it establish a relationship with this little fellow without revealing its true identity? Only then could it help the little fellow when facing the scenery without revealing its identity, without appearing out of place. A Jew was still the Jew of the past, but it wasn't the Jew of the past. The long years and the departure of its boss had taught a lot. When it could only face everything on its own and no longer had anyone to rely on, it wasn't that stupid. That Yin Yun is dead. A Jew threw out the bomb it had carefully prepared. Lu Xiaoyi's heart skipped a beat. He hurriedly explained, Lord Jiu, I didn't kill him. No. That was allowed by the masters outside. They said that as long as you were in the Nine Palaces realm, there would be no accidents. It's been like this for tens of thousands of years. How could he die? Before I left, I saw you saving him. A Jew didn't care. Why are you panicking? I didn't say you killed him. Besides, it's normal for you to kill him. That's what Xin Yuan asked you to do. What I'm trying to tell you is that when I was trying to save him, my hand slipped and he died because of that. Lu Xiaoyi felt a little confused. How can existence of such a high realm slip? And he even slipped and killed someone? It was truly unbelievable. But he immediately realized something and immediately continued. That's right. Lord Jiu, you must have saved him. I saw it with my own eyes. I dare to pat my chest and testify for you wherever I go. You don't have to worry. I, Lu Xiaoyi, have always told the truth all my life. I won't tell a single lie, especially to a senior like you. Chapter 249. Hearing this, a Jew's eyes narrowed into slits. This kid was very smart. He had a bright future. He was much more sensible than his stupid boss. Good. It's good that you have this intention, but I don't need you to testify. You have a bunch of secrets, and your butt is not clean. If those cunning old monsters ask you, you will definitely fall into their trap. In order to deal with Xuan Yuan's inevitable questioning, I won't say who he was injured in the battle. That way, they wouldn't target you. Asking you one question and asking everyone else is a different matter altogether. All these years, my realm has been unstable, so I've always been a little depressed. Lu Xiaoyi pecked at the rice like a little chick. That's right. Lord Jiu, you've taken on so many battles at the same time. You've worked hard and made great contributions. If it were someone else, it would have been a mess. This disciple has never fought with Yin Yin. How is that possible? My opponents are only those foundation establishment cultivators who have been cultivating for more than 10 years. He can't match up. Of course, Lu Xiaoyi knew what choice he should make. It was best that the dead Yin Yin was dead. It would save him a lot of trouble. Jiu Lingjun had obviously failed in his duty and arranged him and Yin Yun, who were cultivators of different levels, to fight together. This was a mistake on its part. However, he wouldn't hold on to it. What would he do if word got out? One was a foundation establishment cultivator. The other was a perfected cultivator. Wouldn't he be able to turn a big problem into a small one? Other than earning Jiu Lingjuan's bad impression, he wouldn't get anything. Anyway, Yin Yin's death was worth it, so he just went with the flow. Wouldn't it be nice to earn a favor? A Jew was very satisfied. What he was most afraid of was this little guy's stubborn temper. This was actually very likely because of his background. But now it seemed that this little guy was very flexible. This saved him a lot of trouble. Although he felt that he had the obligation to help the little guy, he was still a lazy spirit in essence. His plan was very successful. At least from the little guy's point of view, he had caught his weakness, so he could rightfully give him some benefits. Perfect. Little E is very sensible. Lord Jiu is very happy. I won't accept your kindness for nothing. Come, I'll give you a token. In the future, you can use this token to enter the Nine Palace realm. Lu Xiaoyi took the token and said indifferently, Ninth Master, I'm usually busy with my cultivation, so I might not be able to visit you often. What are you doing here? The space was as big as a piece of tofu, and the landscape was very ordinary. Although it was full of spiritual vigor, he did not lack this at the moment. A Jew narrowed her eyes. I'll take advantage of my seniority to say something. Little E, you're cultivating in the star system, right? Don't you feel the difference between the realm of 9 palaces and the dome? When Lu Xiaoyi heard this, he felt that it made sense. Master Jiu is right. I seem to be closer to the stars here. A Jew smiled wretchedly. Look, the difference between the world of 9 palaces and any other place in the 5th ring is that there's no atmospheric barrier here. Therefore, it will be easier for you to sense the stars. Have you ever thought about what would happen if you spent all the time cultivating the star system in the world of 9 palaces? Lu Xiaoyi was very tempted. This was the best way for him to get rid of cultivators of the same realm. His martial arts were basically based on the stars. However, cultivators only had the ability to fly out of the atmosphere and into the universe when they reached the Yuanying realm. Foundation establishment Jin Dan could not do anything unless he was loaded into a floating raft and carried here and there. Then, will it be too troublesome for Lord Jiu? A Jew laughed loudly. No trouble, no trouble. Your Lord Jiu likes to eat braised food, chicken buttocks, duck buttocks, and so on. Bring me more. These things are more ordinary and down-to-earth. It's hard for me to say anything to those old-fashioned people in Xinyuan. On Wenguang Peak, cultivators poured out of the wild beasts' mouths in succession. 73 of them went in, and 72 came out. Something had happened. Yin Xiao and Gu Qi counted nervously, but there was not a single one missing. This was a little strange. Could it be that something had happened to the inner sword system? That couldn't be. The inner sword system was the direct line of descent. It would not be their turn. What was going on? They looked at the old Taoist master, who nodded solemnly. Yin Yin, something happened. I heard from Jiuling Jun that something happened during a battle. Jiuling Jun was not able to save him. Yin Xiao and Gu Qi looked at each other. This was even more inconceivable. Of course, they knew Yin Yin. He was the person who tortured and killed Yin Cheng. His strength was one of the top among this batch of 19 inner swords. If he was seriously injured and could not be saved, then who was the one who injured him? Was there such a person among the outer swords? 23 10-year Foundation establishment cultivators were released on the spot, leaving only 31 cultivators above 20 years to be questioned repeatedly. Of course, it was not to find out who was responsible. In fact, the responsibility was very clear. It was just that everyone was too embarrassed to say it out loud. In fact, they just wanted to know who was pretending to be a pig to eat a tiger. How could they do this? If they found the culprit, they would definitely protect him. This investigation was destined to be fruitless, because the real culprit was now shopping in the market below Thousand Elegance Peak. Lu Xiaoyi had some new ideas. He needed to purchase some materials to verify them. The experience in the realm of 9 palaces told him that in the 5th ring, his ability was far from being able to achieve perfect protection. This time, in the realm of 9 palaces, he faced cultivators who were less than 50 years Foundation establishment cultivators. If he left the dome roof, he could face cultivators who were 70 years, 100 years, or even 200 years Foundation establishment cultivators. Then, would he have a chance to turn the tables? Against the inner sword system, he had a special ability to restrain the sword pill. However, this was only an internal conflict. If he left the dome roof, he would have to fight against those genius cultivators who were on par with the inner swords. This trump card of his was meaningless. Moreover, even if he had a heaven-defying ability against the sword pill, it would not last forever. The reason why he could restrain Yin Yin's sword pill was because Yin Yin's mastery of the sword pill was not deep enough. If it was an inner sword with a firmer will and deeper control of the sword pill might not necessarily retreat. He did not know the origin of his special ability. He only knew about it when he was choosing the sword pill in the square. At that time, when he just came out of the small world of the sword tomb, the sword pill retreated from him. Because of this, it caused a lot of trouble. However, he knew that there was a limit to this retreating. He could not rely on this as a basis to fight. Occasionally, when things came to a head, it was because he had no other choice. However, he could not rely on this as a basis. He still did not understand Lingjuan's invitation. The relationship between cultivators was very complicated. Some invitations were indeed sincere, while others were just out of politeness. Lingjun really did not know what was good for him. For someone like Lingjun, his position in the Xianyuan Sword School was extraordinary and unique. He did not believe that the death of a Foundation establishment cultivator, even if it was a precious inner sword, would have any effect on him. Even if he knew that Lingjun had committed dereliction of duty by mixing cultivators of different levels together, so what? Was he unpardonably evil? However, Jiu Lingjuan's invitation was indeed very attractive to him. Therefore, he thought that he would not be in a hurry to go in and cultivate. Instead, he would wait for a period of time to bring some gifts to sound out Jiu Lingjuan's attitude. Then he would decide what to do next. Relationships had to be maintained. The first principle of interaction was to not be annoying, not to be as clingy as a dog's skin plaster. Chapter 250. He had to improve his hardcore. What was hardcore? It was the power of a flying sword. If a swordsman's flying sword was not feared by others, then he had already lost half the battle. Just like his flying sword. Not to mention Yin Yun. Even the first 10-year inner sword he met didn't care too much about it. It could easily chase after him under his attacks. That would not work. It would be a joke. It had to be done. Once my sword strikes, you would have to put up all your mental defenses, and you might not even be able to defend against it. This was the true essence of a swordsman. Only then would he be able to gain an advantage in the future. Only then would he be able to end a swordsman's battle quickly. To improve the power of his flying sword, he had two paths. One was the main path, which was to improve his communication with the sword spirit. This was also his future direction, and it would not be outdated even when he reached perfected Yuanying. In fact, it would only become more and more important. But this would require time, a very long time. The other path was to make up for it, and that was to carve a sword formation. As his realm increased, there might be some changes in the carving of sword formations. But in the middle and lower realms, especially in the foundation establishment stage, sword formations were extremely important. In terms of effectiveness, it was even better than the sword spirit. This was a fact that he had to admit. He could not ignore sword formations just because they might disappear after he became a perfected monarch. If he wanted to grow, he had to walk this path. It was impossible to skip it. What's the point of practicing martial arts? His talent in sword formations was very limited. If he had to do it himself, carving sword formations would be a waste of time and resources. But now, he had thought a good idea. He could actually find a helper. Of course, it was not to find a human helper. The biggest taboo for a swordsman was to have someone else carve a sword formation for him. This would prevent the swordsman from fully utilizing the flying sword's power in battle, and might even cause problems when controlling the sword. The helper he would find was the sword spirit. Why not let the sword spirit carve a sword formation for him? This way, it would save him a lot of trouble. The sword spirit would also carve out the sword array that it liked the most. Wouldn't it be the best of both worlds? He only needed to provide enough materials, and then cooperate with the flying sword throughout the entire process of engraving. This way, the flying sword, the sword spirit, and the flying sword would all increase their strength together. This was probably the best way to bring out the flying sword's power, right? He purchased the material for the 6th level of the sword array of the 10 sword strike stratum, as well as a few sets of materials for the 4-season sword song. According to his judgment, the Ju City sword spirit could start from the 6th level. However, the 4-season sword spirit would not be easy to do, because the sword array was already fully inscribed. If he simply continued to inscribe, who knew how much more power he would gain? This was an experiment that consumed a lot of resources, but he had to try and find out the regularity of the sword formation carved by the sword spirit. For the time being, he still had enough spiritual stones on hand because of the reward. He had accumulated more than 1,000 medium spiritual stones over the past 7 years. If that was not enough, he still had 2 precious spiritual jades. He also didn't know if Jiu Yi would agree if he went to the 9 Palaces realm to borrow spiritual jades. Lu Xiaoyi decided to start from the 4 Seasons sword spirit. Although the 4 Seasons flying sword was already fully engraved, it would be difficult for the sword spirit to carve further since there was no sword art or sword array to rely on. However, the advantage was that he and the 4 Seasons sword spirit had already been together for 7 years. They had a certain level of understanding of each other and knew each other well. It was a night with a bright moon and few stars. The surroundings were silent, except for the endless crashing sounds of the ice river flowing down. Lu Xiaoyi took out the Four Seasons flying sword and arranged all the materials that he could use. Then, he began to communicate with the Four Seasons sword spirit. What made him happy was that the sword spirit accepted his suggestion and also faintly revealed its dissatisfaction with the current 5 levels of the sword array. He gave the Four Seasons sword spirit full authority, and he was only responsible for providing spiritual power and magic power support. This made the sword spirit very excited. Even if it was a sword spirit, it had its own independent thoughts and longed for the respect of humans. Then, to Lu Xiaoyi's surprise, the sword spirit's first action was not to engrave, but to destroy. It guided Lu Xiaoyi's magic power to melt the sword array that he had spent so much effort on. This was not only time and effort, but also a considerable amount of resources. Lu Xiaoyi did not stop it. He continued to provide spiritual power support. He had already guessed the Four Seasons sword spirit's thoughts. Since the foundation was not suitable, how could it build a tall building on it? The Four Seasons sword spirit wanted to engrave the Four Seasons sword song from the beginning. Lu Xiaoyi supported it unconditionally. There can be no construction without destruction. He wanted to see what kind of level the flying sword could reach under the sword spirit's choice. All 5 levels of the sword array were destroyed. This was the Four Seasons sword spirit's doing. Not to mention how much more he would have to spend in the future. Just a few hundred mid-grade spirit stones were gone. Lu Xiaoyi's heart was bleeding, but his expression did not change. This was the price to pay for wanting to be strong. They did not start to engrave the sword array again. Destroying the array was also very exhausting, whether it was Lu Xiaoyi or the Four Seasons sword spirit. So, although the sword spirit was very excited, he was still ordered to rest. He needed the results of all 3 parties in their best condition and not for the sake of speed. The next day, at the same time, Lu Xiaoyi felt that he and the Four Seasons sword spirit had both recovered to their best condition. So, he officially began to engrave the sword array. This was actually not his or the sword spirit's actions alone, but a kind of tacit understanding between the 2 parties. The sword spirit would choose the suitable materials, and Lu Xiaoyi would use his magic to melt them. Then, with the support of his powerful mental power, the sword spirit would be responsible for guiding the engraving of the sword array. After 7 years of using it, the sword spirit had a very deep understanding of sword arrays. He knew which parts were useless and which parts were useful and needed to be strengthened. This was the sword spirit's instinct. It was the feeling closest to the essence of a sword, and it was also the most compatible with it. It was the variant of the Four Seasons sword song. The sword spirit made a subversive change to the first layer of the sword formation. The sword formation it carved was not the original water-type speed sword formation of the first layer. Instead, it was a combination of the water-type sword formation of the first layer and the wood-type sword formation of the third layer, forming a brand new attribute. When the sword array was completed, everything was clear. Wood and water as wind. Wind-type speed sword array. This was something the humans could not do. Or rather, a foundation establishment cultivator like Lu Xiaoyi could not understand at all. Maybe in the future, when he formed his Azoth core or became a nascent soul, he would understand it. But now is not the time. Right now, foundation establishment cultivators could only make limited use of it and could not understand the principles behind it. But for something like the sword spirit, this was its instinct. It might not be able to explain the principles behind it, but it did not mean that it could not carve it out based on its instincts. If the sword spirit's choice of the first sword array was out of his expectations, then the second choice was something that he could not understand. The sword spirit began to engrave the second sword array, which was a simplified version of the original 4th level's Earth-type sword array. Pure Earth, the most extreme Earth, Earth that could not be any simpler. Chapter 251. By the time the sword spirit finished inscribing the first 2 sword arrays, without Lu Xiaoyi's supervision, it fell into a state of seclusion. It seemed that inscribing sword arrays was equally stressful for it. On the 3rd night, the Four Seasons sword spirits carved an identical wind-type speed sword formation on the 3rd level of the sword formation. It was almost identical to the first level. On the fourth layer, it was another simple earth attribute sword array. At this point, Lu Xiaoyi had a rough idea of what the four-season sword spirit was thinking. It was using the two sword arrays as a foundation to inscribe alternately. Thinking about the sword spirit's thinking, it seemed to make a lot of sense. There was no need to talk about the wind attribute sword array. To a flying sword, nothing was more important than speed. As for the earth attribute sword array, it was probably the most suitable material for this sword embryo. Because when he bought this sword embryo, the shop owner had said that the sword embryo's greatest characteristic was its inertia. It was not restricted by its element and was not afraid of fire, cold, water, or metal. Then, for a sword embryo made of such a material, the sword spirit born would naturally be close to inertia, which was the earth attribute. He understood a little now. The preference of a sword spirit after birth was closely related to the sword embryo. A fire attribute sword embryo would give birth to a sword spirit that was of the fire attribute. It was impossible for it to give birth to an ice attribute sword spirit. Since he knew the general direction of the engraving process, the rest was very simple. He went to the market of Thousand Elegance Peak and changed all the materials of the other attributes to these few materials. He wanted to see just how far the four-season sword spirit could go with this engraving process. 10 days later, the four-season sword spirit finally sent a message that it was exhausted. Unless it continued to grow stronger in the years to come, the sword array's layers would be its limit. Lu Xiaoyi suppressed his excitement and held the flying sword in his hand. This was an 8-layered flying sword, with 4 layers of wind element speed and 4 layers of earth element. They covered the sword alternately and were integrated as one. Because he had participated in the entire process, he, the sword spirit, and the flying sword had established a family-like relationship. This was a real flying sword. In the original choice of the four-season sword formation, he had abandoned the metal and fire sword formations and only kept the wood and earth sword formations. It could be said that he had maximized the simplicity of the sword formation. Or, to put another way, the sword spirit born from the inert sword embryo did not like the metal and fire sword formations. This was in line with its nature. Just because there's wind doesn't mean that it'll be compatible with fire. The powers of the 5 elements each had their own specialties. For example, the sharpness of metal, the wound of fire, the softness of water, the vitality of wood, and the laziness of earth. In terms of penetrating power, of course, metal was slightly better. The other 4 elements were slightly weaker, but they each had their own specialties. For example, fire elemental flying swords would have a unique fire elemental burning power, while Lu Xiaoyi's 4 seasons flying swords were earth elemental. The advantage was that they had a great resistance to other elemental attributes. In a battle between swordsmen, this wasn't obvious, because swordsman's nature in the foundation establishment stage was to pursue strength and speed. In terms of attributes, they were only dependent on the sword formation. But against a spell cultivator, a purely inert flying sword was too useful. Spell cultivators were naturally proficient in spells. In view of the arrogance of the sword vein on the 5 rings, preparing a few corrosive spells that specifically targeted flying swords was standard equipment in a spell cultivator's arsenal. This kind of countermeasure was useless against the inner swords, but it made the outer swords especially uncomfortable. If they really met a powerful spell cultivator, the outer swordsman wouldn't be willing to use his sword, because using the sword would mean the destruction of the flying sword. This was the value of an earth elemental flying sword. It wasn't afraid of the opponent's corrosive filth, and with the sword spirit's recovery and repair, it meant that no matter the environment, he would dare to use his sword. This was very important to the outer swords. Lu Xiaoyi didn't do it deliberately, but with all kinds of coincidences, he naturally achieved his goal. He didn't know if it was because he swallowed the 2 cultivators' balls of fortune, but his luck was slowly changing. The important thing was that after the 4 seasons sword spirits modification, the 4 seasons flying sword speed and power had a fundamental increase. Previously, The power of his sword was only the combined power of an immature sword spirit and a trashy 5-layer sword formation, which was the power of an ordinary outer swordsman. He could only win by relying on his outer swords. But now, the power of the sword formation alone had reached the average standard of an ordinary outer sword, and with the addition of the sword spirit, if he faced Yin now, he could no longer ignore the power of his sword. Most of the 10 swords in a breath would have to be used for defense, and the number of swords that could be used to attack him would be limited. This was the essence of a sword battle. It was a complicated combination project. The combination of earth and wind? It made Liu Xiaoyi think of the endless yellow sands of the Gobi Desert. This was the will of the heavens. It made one sigh. The 4 Seasons flying sword no longer lived up to its name. There were no 4 seasons, only wind and sand season. What made him most satisfied was that this wasn't the limit of the flying sword. It could actually grow, including the growth of the sword spirit. After the sword spirit grew, it could in turn carve more sword formations. 11 years after he entered Xinyuan, he finally had a flying sword with his own unique personality. Maybe now, he could become a real swordsman, an outer swordsman. Liu Xiaoyi didn't immediately order the sword spirit of Ju City to carve sword formations. He already had some experience in using the sword spirit. In his opinion, he needed to set aside a few years to get along with the sword spirit and deepen their mutual understanding. He also needed to give the sword spirit of Ju City a period of time to fully understand the strengths and weaknesses of the 10 charges of Ju City sword technique. It would be best if he could go through some battles. Only in this way could the sword spirit slowly explore the most suitable sword formation for himself through practice. Only then could he display the flying sword's advantages to the extreme. He began to wonder if it was time to cultivate a 3rd sword spirit. This was a necessary procedure to strengthen oneself. One flying sword had to be at its peak, one had to be at the stage of deep communication with the sword spirit, and one flying sword had to be ready to slash someone and give birth to a sword spirit. He realized that there were more and more things to do. Cultivation had long surpassed what he had once thought. Just to live for a few hundred more years, there was always some involuntary push that pushed you forward. When you didn't have enough to eat, you only had one pain. When you were full, you would have endless pain. This was his current state. Regarding the new flying sword and sword technique, there was a principle. He had to be like the 4 Seasons and Ju City sword. He had to carve several layers of sword formations on the flying sword. The purpose of this was to let the sword spirit familiarize with the essence of the sword technique. Only then could he make the appropriate changes. If it was a bare flying sword, even if there was a chance to use it to slash someone and give birth to a sword spirit, the sword spirit itself wouldn't have the knowledge of sword spirit. All of its knowledge came from the sword formations that had already been carved. This was a process that couldn't be omitted. It also meant that a large amount of resources would be invested. Although he had a headache, Liu Xiaoyi still chose from the 2 remaining sword embryos. Gu Bei's collection was of high quality. This was his life's work. Liu Xiaoyi didn't want to buy another sword embryo. His spirit stones were a little tight now. It was better to make a decision from what he had. Chapter 252. Of the 2 sword embryos, one was made with yang fire crystal as the main material. Needless to say, if he wanted to choose a sword art, he had to choose a fire attribute sword art. The other sword embryo was made with the rare nether passage jade and nether refined gold. It was a special sword embryo made with only one purpose: sneak attacks. Liu Xiaoyi considered the flying swords he already had. The 4 Seasons was of the earth attribute, so it was not afraid of elemental attacks. The Ju Cheng was of the pure strength attribute, so it had a powerful frontal assault ability. Then he actually didn't want to refine a flying sword of the 5 elements. The 5 elements were good things. They were the foundation of all things. But the prerequisite was that you had to have all 5 elements and be able to freely switch between them. Being biased towards only one element could give a cultivator the greatest advantage in certain aspects, but it was also very easy to be targeted. For example, If you cultivated a fire attribute flying sword to the extreme, then your opponent would be able to easily find a way to deal with you. For foundation establishment cultivators, they could only use the power of the 5 elements to a limited extent, and that was with the help of sword arrays. In reality, they knew very little about the basic principles of the 5 elements, and it was impossible for them to switch between the 5 elements. So cultivating a flying sword of a single attribute was very limited. Unless their cultivation reached a certain level, they would be able to attach different elemental powers to their flying swords according to their opponents. After thinking so much, perhaps it was only because he liked sneak attacks more. Sneak attacks did not only refer to quietly approaching and catching the opponent off guard. Instead, it referred to the choice of tactics in battle when other flying swords attracted the opponent's attention. Lu Xiaoyi felt that with such a hidden sword for sneak attacks, it would greatly enrich his tactical system. There was no right or wrong in tactical systems. The key was the understanding and preference of a person towards battle. How to maximize one's advantages and hide one's disadvantages well. This was talent and intuition that could not be learned. People who were good at fighting would have very smart tactical systems. Hidden Fragrance, 10 layers of sword arrays, was the sword art he had prepared for this sword embryo. It was also his last sword art limit. If he wanted to choose another sword art, he would have to wait for nearly 10 years. The current Lu Xiaoyi already looked like he was carrying a sword case. At the very least, the 3 flying swords in the case gave him a sense of fullness. Among the swordsmen in the same batch as him, even if he did not consider the sword spirit, his current progress had already surpassed most of them. At this point, he felt that his strength could be considered barely presentable. Cultivation, to be busy and fulfilling, Lu Xiaoyi began to feel that his time was not enough. He could not stop cultivating. That was the foundation. Big Dito to say which one of them was not to say not to say, not to say was not to say, Spirit Sword to say, he needed to say, he only to spend a small amount of time to practice, to say, to spend a little to say, but he still had a few new techniques. To say, they were not to say, the most time-consuming to say, they did to say, these were to say, to say, to be to say, to be to be to say, to be to say, to be. To be to say, to be to say, to be. The 4 Seasons sword required a large number of monster trainers to be able to unleash its full strength. This was his only main flying sword now. If he encountered a life or death situation, he would have to rely on it. Of course, he could not be careless. Ju City also needed to be released and used to let it familiarize itself with the sword array as quickly as possible, and to achieve as much interaction as possible between human and sword spirit as possible. Hidden Fragrance had already begun to inscribe the sword array. This was a painful process for Lu Xiaoyi. This kind of cultivation intensity puzzled someone as unambitious as Lu Xiaoyi. He was very curious. How did he get to this point? How did he go from being a rice worm who only wanted to live a few hundred more years to being a cultivation maniac? He seemed to have found the answer. Being brought to the 5th ring was the beginning of his hardships. In this domain, one was not allowed to be idle. To put it nicely, this place was full of vitality. To put it bluntly, this was the survival of the fittest among bandits. He could not separate himself from the rest of the world and stand aloof from worldly affairs. Lu Xiaoyi comforted himself. His current hardships were for the enjoyment of the future. He only needed to persevere for a few decades and reach the foundation establishment stage. With a few flying swords like the 4 Seasons sword to protect him, then there would be no more worries, right? He was not yet 50 years old. After working hard, he still had at least 100 years of free time. It was still acceptable. A month later, he decided to pay Jiu Lingjun a visit. In terms of interpersonal relationships, Lu Xiaoyi was relatively passive. In principle, he did not like to trouble others, nor did he like others to disturb his peaceful life. However, he sometimes longed for crowds. This was very contradictory. It was the after effect of his soul drifting in the universe for too long. Towards this Jiu Lingjun, Other than his yearning for the cultivation environment of the Nine Palaces realm, he still had a certain level of caution. A perfected lord was at such a high level. He was an existence of a completely different world from him. Why would he care about a small ant like him? Was there any special purpose in this? This was what he wanted to be clear about. However, one could not deny everything just because of fear and doubt. He did not dare to try. All opportunities had to be fought for. They had to be actively sought after in the balance of risks and benefits. If a pie fell from the sky, one had to judge whether it would kill someone. With such an attitude, no matter how much luck and opportunity one had, it would not be enough to waste. Therefore, he had to go. He did not think that if Jiu Lingjun really had a plot against him, he could avoid it by hiding outside and not going in. Before going, he specially made a trip to the nearest mortal town for Jiu Lingjun's strange hobby. There was nothing embarrassing about liking to eat orifice meat. There was frequent movement in that place every day, and the meat quality was excellent. If one could tolerate that special taste, it would be especially delicious. Other than the chicken orifice and duck orifice, Lu Xiaoyi had also collected a lot of delicacies from this region, including a lot of braised food. In his mind, these were all the same type of food, so Jiu Lingjun probably wouldn't reject them. He did not eat these things himself. This was a health habit from his previous life. These internal organs were rich in heavy metals and were not good for the human body. However, these health concepts were meaningless to an existence like Jiu Lingjun. Even if he ate poison, what harm could it cause? It was just a hobby, a thought. He did not really want to absorb nutrients from it. He was very careful and didn't enter the realm of 9 palaces from any random place in the dome. In his opinion, although he couldn't see any large-scale formations in the sect, there must be something like this. It was hard to imagine that such a huge sect didn't have a surveillance tool in its own place. Therefore, it was not appropriate to find a random place to disappear. It would be easy to be discovered by high-level cultivators. It was better to run back to the cave abode first. It was better to be careful in a strange world. Chapter 253. Inside the abode. When he read the message talisman, he felt the light and shadow around him, and the space was distorted. A strong force pulled him in, and he couldn't resist. Shouldn't he go in by himself? But now he seemed a little impatient. He was now in a hilly landscape, and he was standing in a small farmhouse at the bottom of the hill. There were 2 thatched cottages, 1 main room and 1 side room. There was a toilet at the back of the house, a stone roller in front of the house, and a small piece of land that had been crushed by the stone roller. There was also a small pigsty at the side of the house, and a wooden cage that looked like a chicken coop. It was a picturesque scene of the countryside. However, there were no living creatures. There was a chicken coop, but no pheasants. There was a pig pen, but no swine, and there was a cottage, but no people. This picture of the countryside lacked the breath of life. There was no smell of chicken feces or pig feces. The extremely clean environment made people feel a little strange. He didn't feel anything. He was born rich, so he couldn't see the details. Anyway, it was an environment created by Jiu Lingjun. What was the difference? Before he could enter the house, a light and shadow swayed in the sky. The fatty with mixed hair, oh no, Jiu Lingjun, appeared in front of him and glanced at him. It's just a meal. Is it worth a month of preparation? Do you think it will make you poor? It hoped that this kid could come in quickly. Then, it could reveal the cultivation method of its boss to him bit by bit. It had to help him, but it couldn't be too active. It was very difficult. In its opinion, as long as this kid replicated the cultivation process of its former master, it would be no problem for him to succeed. It didn't know much about the secrets of human cultivation, but it always thought that the reason why its master was so successful was because of its early help. It was very confident about this. There were 2 core secrets of its world of 9 palaces. One was the time ratio, and the other was the space of thunder meteorites. Its former master had worked hard on these 2 aspects, and finally made a name for himself in the Xianyuan sword sect. However, it did not understand that an individual's cultivation process could not be replicated. It depended on too many aspects, such as the right time, The right place, the right people, the right philosophy, the right choice, and countless other influences. It would definitely help, but to what extent it could help was not up to it. Lu Xiaoyi took out the food that he had bought. There were 2 storage rings in total, because he had estimated Jiu Lingjuan's stomach. One could not use a human's appetite to measure it. I'm just afraid of disturbing you, Ninth Master. You're cultivating here alone, but I'm cultivating and releasing my sword here. It's not suitable. A Jew accepted the food and was very satisfied. However, he was not satisfied with this little guy's attitude. He was too polite. This was a little illogical. Logically speaking, as 2 very special souls, a Jew, as an artifact spirit and a sword spirit, should have reached the kind of instinctive and natural closeness that didn't require language or explanation, and the kind that didn't hold back. After all, they had been together for 8,000 years. Even if it was impossible for this kid to awaken anything now, the kind of unreasonable trust that humans could not understand should exist between them. There was no need for a reason. But now this kid was obviously guarding against him. This was a little strange. However, this situation could not be changed for the time being. They needed to understand each other more before they could let go. More haste, less speed. Humans were very complicated creatures. They were twisted and crooked, and it was not pleasant. You can't disturb me. In a 9 Palaces realm, there are thousands of small spaces like this. Even if you tear it down, it won't affect me at all. I say, you brat, are you trying to take advantage of Lord Joe's weakness and have other motives? Let me tell you, my repayment is to allow you to cultivate here. If you come once, we don't owe each other anything. It's the same even if you come 1,000 times or 10,000 times. Don't think that if you come less, I'll owe you. Lu Xiaoyi heard what Jiu Lingjun meant. Was he asking him to come every day and achieve success in cultivation as soon as possible to repay his kindness of exposing Xinyuan? It sounded reasonable, but after thinking about it carefully, there were many suspicious points. Could this be the difference between high-level cultivators and others? To him, cultivating here was only good for him. It was just that he felt uneasy to be helped by others for no reason. If he got along well with others, he knew that he could not refuse other people's requests. This was also his weakness. Was it so easy to owe a debt in the cultivation world? He always thought that it was not a big deal if he did not mention Jiu Lingjuan's dereliction of duty to Xuanyuan's higher-ups. My ability is weak. I may not be able to help you in other aspects, Jiu Lingjun. A Jew could also see that this kid was very cautious, so it could not startle him now. This made it very sullen. It could not even mention the time ratio in the thunder meteorite space. It could only let him slowly figure it out himself. A Jew rarely came into contact with humans and was unable to communicate with humans. It also understood where its problem was. It was too anxious and wished that it could pour out everything it knew to feel comfortable. So it made the right choice. I've lived for tens of thousands of years. What do I need your help with? I'm going to sleep for about 8 to 10 years. I won't wake up until the next internal and external sword competition. You can come to this place if you want to. It's up to you. After telling him how to leave, it disappeared. This was what a senior should be like. Lu Xiaoyi accepted Jiu Lingjuan's kindness. He had already expressed his attitude. Since Jiu Lingjun still agreed to let him cultivate here, he did not need to bear too much pressure, but he set a red line for himself. Other than cultivating here, he would not accept any other gifts. He soon found the first problem. This was not a good place to cultivate the main cultivation method, the Big Dipper Star Scripture, because the spiritual opportunity here was self-generated by the 9 Palaces realm. He did not know where it came from, but he knew that in the introductory cultivation method guide of the Xinyuan Sword Sect, many seniors had mentioned the problem of cultivating in secret spaces. He had also participated in many of these internal cultivation meetings, so he had a deep impression of it. The purest spiritual opportunity in the world was the spiritual opportunity of the world. No matter how much spiritual opportunity there was, it contained a trace of the Great Way. Cultivators might not be able to feel it in a short time, but if they cultivated in a secret space isolated from the main world for a long time, their cultivation might progress very quickly. But if they lost this trace of the Great Way, it would be extremely disadvantageous for them to break through to the upper level in the future. It would greatly reduce the success rate of breaking through to the upper level. Therefore, almost every major sect did not recommend their disciples to cultivate in a secret space for a long time. This was the experience of countless cultivation sects over tens of thousands of years. It was authoritative. Lu Xiaoyi did not want to challenge this authority. His talent was in swordsmanship. In other aspects, he was no different from other rookies. Starlight guidance and being with the stars were also not very meaningful to cultivate here. He could feel the existence of the stars more directly in the Nine Palaces realm. But the problem was that once he left the Nine Palaces realm, he would be isolated by the atmosphere. His future battles would be outside. So who would come here to fight with him? No matter how fast he cultivated starlight guidance, he would be back to his original state once he left the Nine Palaces realm. So it was meaningless. Chapter 254. However, there were also things that were suitable for cultivation here, such as the Z-Way, celestial form, and the star observation transformation. Whether it was the physical strength from the Z-Way, celestial form, or the mental strength from the star observation transformation, he could bring them out of the realm of Nine Palaces and benefit from it in the outside world. It was helpful to him, but not as much as he imagined. This was in line with the concept of cultivation. How could there be so many advantages for you to take? It was not bad to practice his flying sword here because he could be unbridled and did not need to consider hiding his strength. It was a bit worse in the cavern space. Although his place was very remote, it was still within the dome. It was inevitable that sword cultivators would pass by occasionally. If he was only practicing his cultivation method, it would not be a big deal. However, if he used his sword during the star escape, it would be more eye-catching. His flying sword's attack range was still a bit long, far beyond the range of a normal Foundation establishment cultivator. To him, a more reasonable cultivation arrangement would be to take a few hours out every day to come here to practice swordsmanship, the purple star form, and the star transformation. He would usually arrange for this time to be in the afternoon for a few hours, and then rush back in the evening to continue his cultivation. However, on the third day, he found a problem. The time was wrong. Actually, he felt it on the first day. After practicing swordsmanship for 4 hours in the realm of Nine Palaces, he should have come out at the beginning of the evening. After making some adjustments, he could practice the Big Dipper scripture. However, when he came out, he found that it was the end of the evening. There was a difference of 15 minutes from the time he predicted. Cultivators were very sensitive to time. Each of them was a precise clock. It was basically impossible to make a mistake. Even if there was, it would be a minute difference. It was impossible for there to be a difference of 15 minutes. Therefore, when he entered the realm of Nine Palaces on the second day, he deliberately checked the time. After he entered, he started counting the time and left 4 hours later. In the end, when he came out, he was 15 minutes earlier. If there was nothing wrong with his brain, then the concept of time in the realm of Nine Palaces was different from the outside world. He was a complete layman when it came to time and space. He couldn't be sure if this change in time and space would have any effect on his cultivation. If it didn't it mean that he could practice 15 minutes more than others in a day? Although the difference was small, the meaning was completely different. On the third day, he couldn't bear it anymore. He couldn't be at ease if he didn't ask clearly, "Master Gio, are you still there? Are you asleep?" He didn't yell because he knew that the volume of his voice was meaningless to an existence like Gio Lingjun. No matter how loud he was, if he didn't want to hear him, even if he was in a good mood, he could still answer him. It would be rude if he was loud. He did not intend to ask more than once. If Gio Lingjun did not agree, he would choose to leave the Nine Palaces realm and never come back. Gio was Gio. To protect himself, Gio himself. Just when he thought that his question had been ignored and was about to leave, a lazy voice sounded, but Zhu Lingjun did not appear. A Jew had already reacted. With his status, he should put on airs. If he did everything himself, people would look down on him. Humans were so cheap. If you were nice to them, they would be suspicious. If you ignored them, they would stick to you. To me, I just finished washing my feet and am about to go to bed. If you have something to say it quickly. Don't disturb your master's rest. Lu Xiaoyi hurriedly apologized and then asked, Master Jiu, why do I feel that the flow of time here is different from the time outside? It seems to be slower here. I wonder if I'm mistaken, or if it's a characteristic of the realm of 9 palaces? A Jew understood immediately. At least she was not too stupid. What do you think? Do you think the cultivation ground provided by the 9th Elder is that simple? Not only will it bring you closer to the stars, but it will also slow down the flow of time. You will have more time to cultivate than the people outside. Let's put it this way. The realm of 9 palaces is not within the 5 rings, but follows a certain trajectory in the void. When the realm of 9 palaces overlaps with the 5 rings, the realm of 9 palaces will be open for a month, and then it will leave. At the end of the first year, the time will be twice as fast, and the second year will be 3 times as fast. 5 years later, the realm of 9 palaces will move back, and the time multiplier will decrease. 10 years later, when the time multiplier no longer exists, it will overlap with the 5 rings again, and the realm of 9 palaces will open. Do you understand what I'm saying? Lu Xiaoyi was a little confused. I don't really understand. A Jew was annoyed. Of course you don't understand. I have controlled the realm of 9 palaces for tens of thousands of years, but I still don't understand. But it's not a bad thing. It's a great thing. This means that every day, the time in the realm of 9 palaces will increase. It has been a few days since the opening of the realm of 9 palaces, so you can only feel the difference of a moment. This difference will become bigger and bigger until 1 year later, 2 hours outside will be 4 hours inside. 5 years later, you will cultivate here for 10 hours, which will be equivalent to 2 hours outside. How can anyone enjoy such an advantage? You're lucky to have such an opportunity. If it were someone else, I wouldn't even care about them. I know what you're worried about. Aren't you worried that this change in time and space will affect your cultivation? Let me tell you, the last person who took advantage of the time here became an immortal. Then, whether it's good or bad, do I need to say more? All right, I'm going to sleep. I can't be bothered with you. The last person who cultivated here became an immortal. This Jiuling Jun really dared to brag. Did he take him for a fool? If he really became an immortal, he would take him, his benefactor, to the immortal world to enjoy life. Why are you still standing here? Lu Xiaoyi complained in his heart, but he was too embarrassed to say it out loud. It was better to keep such bragging in one's heart and not expose it. Everyone would feel awkward. However, he didn't think that Jiuling Jun was lying about the time. There was no need for him to exaggerate and slap himself in the face for something that could be verified very soon. As for whether it would affect him or not, he judged that it probably wouldn't. His cultivation methods were all in the main world outside. What he cultivated here was only swordsmanship. They were 2 completely different concepts. In the cultivation world, there was a fundamental difference between magic and technique. Magic was the foundation, and technique was the surface. As long as a cultivator walked on the right path, it wouldn't affect his future. Thinking about the time in the future, Lu Xiaoyi was really tempted. His current achievement in swordsmanship was that he didn't have enough time to communicate with the sword spirits and nurture them. Now that he had such an opportunity, he wouldn't let it go. However, this way, he would owe Jiuling Jun a favor. This was something that couldn't be helped. If he had a request one day, he wouldn't be able to get away with it. There was always a trade-off. It was good that he thought it through. Chapter 255. Lu Xiaoyi's cultivation began to get on the right track, on the fast track. Every cultivator had to go through such a process in their growth. In the words of mortals, it was called enlightenment. Entering the Tao was a watershed. It was the difference between sensing qi and being slow, the difference between cultivators and mortals. However, this didn't mean that a cultivator's path would be smooth sailing. The next hurdle was foundation establishment. After succeeding in foundation establishment, Many people thought that the next hurdle was naturally Jean Dan, but such thinking was one-sided. In reality, after a cultivator succeeded in foundation establishment, the biggest problem they faced was the problem of direction. How should they walk on their own path? 100 foundation establishment cultivators had 100 paths. Which path belonged to them? What was the most suitable path for them? They should have an accurate judgment. This wasn't just a question of cultivation methods, but also of skills. First, they had to have the means to protect themselves. This was a complicated system. This had nothing to do with whether they joined a sect or not, or whether the sect was strong or weak. The sect would provide them with thousands of choices, but the final decision could only be made by them. If they made the right choice and suited themselves, they would be on the fast track. Even if there were occasional setbacks, it wouldn't change the upward trend of Dafa. If they made the wrong choice, they would bite off more than they could chew. They would be flashy, but not practical. If they didn't start from their own point of view, they would strive for the bigger picture. Or if they followed behind others in everything, they would be fated to progress slowly. They would be stuck in a rut for their entire life. It was as if everything went against them, and fate would no longer favor them. In reality, it was the wrong choice of their own Tao direction. Lu Xiaoyi was very opinionated. Ever since he entered Xianyuan, he didn't consider the mainstream as his only choice. This was the reason why the entire star system was established to suit his characteristics. He didn't mindlessly choose the most swordsman system just to become a qualified swordsman. Even if you learned the most swordsman things, you wouldn't become a true swordsman. It wasn't until he found a way to produce a sword spirit and found the most perfect way to inscribe sword formations that it could be said that after 10 years in Xianyuan, he had stepped into his own rhythm in terms of both cultivation methods and skills. If the rhythm was right, everything would go smoothly. Advancing bravely would be a cinch. He was lucky and had his own thoughts. Therefore, all of this was both accidental and inevitable. Would most swordsmen choose the colder star system? Would he continue to wait for changes to appear and insist on not investing a huge amount of mental and physical resources in the engraving of sword formations? If it was someone else, if they realized that their talent in sword formations was not enough, 9 out of 10 of them would work hard on it. If they did not have enough talent, they would work hard to make up for it. They would train hard and throw in resources. In the end, they would be able to reach or even surpass the average standard with their own efforts. However, they would spend a lot of time and resources in this kind of hard work. In the end, they would only be able to reach the average standard and not fall behind. The direction of their efforts was wrong from the very beginning. How much a wooden barrel could hold depended on the shortest piece. Everyone understood this principle, so everyone would fill the shortest piece. But swordsman was not a wooden barrel. Swordsmen were famous in the universe, not because they were good at everything, but because they were at the pinnacle of a certain aspect. Swordsmen were like this, and in fact, it was the same for magic cultivators. There is no need to set yourself up according to the mainstream and then develop yourself within this framework. The correct way to go about it was to first understand your own strengths and where your advantages were, then persevere to expand this advantage. You might not reach the average standard because of your extremes, but once you succeed, you would definitely surpass the average standard and become a top-notch existence. Time in the realm of 9 palaces was just as Jiu Lingjun said. The days were longer than the days before. Now that it was the end of the 3rd year, every 6 hours he spent in the realm of 9 palaces was only 2 hours in the outside world. The benefit this brought him was that the time he spent with the 3 flying swords had greatly increased. As a swordsman, even if he was passionate about swords, he could not spend all his time on practicing swordsmanship. There would always be countless directions that required his attention, such as the main technique that determined his cultivation, supplementary techniques, how to earn resources to support his swords, certain interpersonal relationships, missions assigned by the sect, and so on. Spending 6 to 8 hours a day on swords was already the maximum limit. This was the reality of most swordsmen's cultivation. Lu Xiaoyi spent at least 20 hours a day on swords, and this was all done through the realm of 9 palaces. This allowed his usage of flying swords to improve by leaps and bounds. As the only main flying sword, the Four Seasons had already reached the level where he could control it with his thoughts. The communication with the Ju City Sword Spirit was progressing smoothly, and Lu Xiaoyi estimated that he would soon be able to re-engrave the sword formation with the Ju City Sword Spirit. The only reason he had not started was because he was a little tight on money. He had already engraved up to the 5th level of the sword formation for the Hidden Fragrance flying swords. This was practically his limit, and he did not plan to continue. The rest would be completed by the awakening of the sword spirit. Spirit stones were spent like water. The Hidden Fragrance 5-level sword formation had almost emptied all his savings, and the Ju City Sword Spirit could not even begin the re-engraving of the sword formation. This was also under the condition that he had the help of the sword spirit. If he were to inscribe sword formations like other sword cultivators, with his aptitude, even if he spent all his fortune on a flying sword, it was hard to say if he could reach the 7th or 8th level. In fact, for a swordsman with his experience, most of them would only have one flying sword at their level. If they were greedy, they would not be able to refine even one. This was not only a matter of time, but also a matter of resources. He received a sword letter from the cigarette box Ling Ruofeng, inviting him to a gathering. However, this time, it was not the small circle from his original world, and there were many other swordsmen as well. The only thing that did not change was that they were all from the Outlands and were in the same faction. This was one of the few invitations from Ling Ruofeng in the past 10 years. Other than the first time, Lu Xiaoyi had been absent several times. This time, it would not be good for him to be absent again. It was still the same ring-shaped mountain, but there were many people coming and going, and it was very lively. It seemed that Ling Ruofeng's small group had met many people in the past 10 years. Everyone had gone from being in the dark when they first entered the sect to being able to handle it with ease now. With more than 10 years of experience in the Dome, they could probably be considered half a veteran, right? Lu Xiaoyi was not the only one who was improving. Everyone was improving. It was still Ling Ruofeng who came up to him. He was the only one in the group who could still talk to Lu Xiaoyi. It was not because they were close, but because of Ling Ruofeng's temper. He was more like a person who rolled around in the mortal world. He liked this, and he had a natural ability to communicate with people. Little E, you're here? Come in quickly. There are many friends here today, and some are even experts in the sword. Little E, you should interact with them more. There will be a time when you can help in the future. When two people met, it was not good to call each other by their Dharma names. It was awkward. It was better to call each other by their names, and it would make them feel closer. Chapter 256. The last time there were fewer people, it was a barbecue. This time, there were many people, so they did not prepare anything. The cultivators did not care about this. Sima, Beinan, Erong, Xiaoluo, and I went on a mission together. It took us almost 3 years to go back and forth. It was a long journey with countless dangers. We even fought with cultivators from other forces. I have learned a lot. Where did Xiaoyi go? Lu Xiaoyi was about to answer, but Ling Ruofeng continued. The 5th ring is really huge. We didn't even leave the western regions after 3 years. It really makes people speechless. In a few years, when our strength reaches a higher level, we will go out of the western regions to broaden our horizons. Xiaoyi will come too. With everyone looking after him, there won't be any accidents. Lu Xiaoyi smiled and nodded. This was Ling Ruofeng. He did not want to know everything about you. He just wanted you to know about his so-called arduous journey. In fact, it was easy to find out about Lu Xiaoyi's movements in the past 3 years. He just had to ask around in the admission hall. It was just that no one took him seriously. There were tens of thousands of cultivators at the bottom of the dome. It was like a pyramid. Those who stood at the top of the pyramid were always the minority. People like them who had been in the foundation establishment for more than 10 years did not have the qualifications to be ranked in this circle. This was because they had not completely left the foundation stage. Only after 50 years of foundation establishment, when all aspects were fixed and their cultivation had reached the late stage of foundation establishment, would they have the qualifications to challenge the heroes of the Dome? Now, they were just swordsman rookies. Their cultivation and sword skills were insufficient. They did not even have many flying swords in the sword case on their backs. How could they compete with others? Their current circle, to be precise, was the circle of rookies. Most of the people who came today were below 50 years of foundation establishment. Birds of a feather flocked together. In the Dome, there are many such circles. For example, the circle of mature swordsmen who had been in the foundation establishment for more than 50 years. What they cared about was completely different from what Ling Ruofeng and the others cared about. There were also the local circles of the Fifth Ring and Zhuo Zhou Qingkong Circle. They were only here to entertain themselves. In this small group from the three lower realms, the most attractive people were the three Kun cultivators, Qin Erong, Mu Kaling, and Tang Xiaoluo. Not all sword cultivators hoped to have a Dao companion, but with such a large base, only a small portion of them needed to come, and it was enough to make this place extraordinarily lively. Everyone had their own plans for the future. No matter where they were, those who practiced hard and abstained from hard work were in the minority. For the majority of people, even if they didn't enjoy themselves while they could, they wouldn't treat themselves unfairly. You would never know which would come first, tomorrow, or an accident. Dao companions were the best helpers. They supported each other and encouraged each other. Among all the relationships in the cultivation world, they were one of the stronger ones. If they had a bloodline, they would have more to worry about. It couldn't be said that cultivators were animals that relied on the lower half of their bodies to think, but in the process of cultivation, foundation establishment was indeed the most desirable realm for a Dao companion. There were many reasons. Foundation establishment cultivators were not like mortals, but they were the lowest in all the realms. This meant that their ability to resist the temptations of the outside world was lower, including beauty. Among all the realms, only foundation establishment cultivators could benefit the most from dual cultivation. It was also a standard shortcut. Most importantly, for those cultivators who were keen on leaving behind their bloodline, the foundation establishment stage was the stage with the highest probability. As the realm increased, it would become more difficult for the golden core stage cultivators to pass down their bloodline, not to mention the higher realms. Basically, it was very unlikely for them to give birth to descendants. Therefore, it was understandable that so many cultivators would flaunt their feathers in front of the few Kun cultivators. These sword cultivators who came all hoped that after becoming Dao companions, both parties would have a certain common language. If it was only for the sake of bloodline, there were plenty of earth cultivators from small sects outside. They were gentle, beautiful, and not so fierce. Everyone had their own hobbies. Lu Xiaoyi did not participate in their fight. He just quietly wandered around the periphery, admiring the sparring between the swordsmen and listening to the comments of the talkers. There were constructive things, and there were also childish nonsense. They were all explorations of swordsmanship, and there was no need to laugh at anyone. He had never fought with an external swordsman before. He had never even sparred with them before, and he had already lost interest in this aspect. A flying sword with a sword spirit and a flying sword without a sword spirit were not the same species. If he did not deliberately hide his strength, his foundation would be exposed. However, this was also the reason why he carried hidden fragrance. Cultivating in a low-key manner, doing what he liked, and having the ability to reject all unreasonable requests. This was the state he liked. Swordsman seeking a Dao companion was not a playboy. They had their own plans for cultivation, and it was a very serious matter. Of course, it was rare for jealousy to occur. What was the point of finding a Dao companion who was not of the same mind as you? They would kill you in minutes during dual cultivation. Every swordsman with their own goals was basically courteous, not only to the Kun cultivators, but also to their competitors. What they needed to do was to show the side they were best at. Their demeanor, temperament, style of conversation, and handling matters were to look forward to further contact with the Kun cultivators in the future. That was all. A pursuer who was hated by everyone would definitely be hated by the Koan cultivators. Therefore, the circle around the Koan cultivators only lasted for a short period of time. Everyone quickly shifted their interest to swordsmanship. Xin Yuan, 5 rings. In sparring, in conversation, it was also the best way to show that they were different from the rest. In the sparring, swordsmanship was somewhat lackluster. This was because the ones who came down were all foundation establishment cultivators of 1 to 20 years. It was unrealistic to expect them to have outstanding achievements in swordsmanship. Perhaps there were some with extraordinary talent, but these people were basically the same as Lu Xiaoyi. They either refused to come or silently hid in the crowd. They were very clear that this was not their stage to perform. Their scope was too small. The topics of discussion were not all pleasant. There were also sad things, such as someone who had lost their life in a certain incident, a certain journey, or a certain mission. This happened to almost everyone and was not far away. In the cultivation world, there are all kinds of coincidences that are unimaginable. Fate is always like this. Just like 90 years ago, a group of people from the Blue Sky sect accidentally discovered a secret realm. After some exploration, their gains were unknown. But decades later, the Sentinel cultivators who participated in this Sentinel realm formed Jindan one after another. At that time, 7 people entered, and now 4 of them have successfully formed their gold cores. The remaining 3 are also looking for opportunities to break through. Tell me, what kind of fate is this? One of the cultivators sighed, while the other retorted, "That's right. Senior brother, you're just reporting the good news and not the bad news." I also heard of such a strange story. A group of external swordsmen were on a mission in Arai and encountered a storm on the sea. They drifted on the sea for more than 10 years before returning. But in their subsequent cultivation, this group of cultivators encountered accidents one after another. It was either inner demons entering their bodies, mental exhaustion, or the backflow of their magic power. It was as if they encountered some kind of unsolvable curse on the sea. Chapter 257. Cultivators also believed in the mysteries. It was precisely because they came into contact with cultivators that they believed that everything was arranged by fate. Thus, everyone turned their attention to all kinds of strange things, especially the strange things that happened at the Dome and Xuanyuan Sword School. A swordsman said mysteriously, "What you've heard are all legends that happened decades, or even centuries ago. I wonder if you've heard of a strange thing that happened recently?" Everyone was curious. The swordsman laughed mischievously and said, "This is a strange thing that happened less than 4 years ago. For years ago, most of you here had been in the sect for 10 years and had to accept missions from the sect to travel outside. I believe everyone here has experienced this before, right?" Everyone nodded. This was the rule. Xin Yuan didn't encourage swordsmen to stay in the cave and cultivate painstakingly. Those who cultivated this way would only be cultivation fools and wouldn't be of much use if they encountered a problem. The sect didn't necessarily require their disciples to go out once every few years. In a cultivator's life, only the 10-year threshold of entering the sect was a mandatory requirement. In fact, it was a kind of attitude telling the disciples what Xuanyuan style was like. As for the future, everyone could do as they pleased. But if the sect didn't impose a mandatory requirement, would the swordsmen just stay in the cave? Regardless of whether it was the local sect of the Fifth Ring sect or the old sect of the Blue Sky sect, those who could enter Xuanyuan's sect were all strong-willed. This was because they started cultivating from a young age with this kind of passion. The only ones who weren't as strong were the foreign disciples. They were abducted, and not everyone was suited to the swordsman style. But under the overall situation, if you didn't go out, what kind of future would you have by staying in the cave? If you relied on the pitiful benefits of the sect, you might be able to last for a few decades when you first entered the sect. But once your cultivation slowly increased, and the flying sword's demands became more and more demanding, if you didn't go out to look for money, do missions, and hunt for hidden realms, what would you use to support your own cultivation? Forcing cultivators to rush about for the sake of cultivation training themselves into talents that could withstand critical moments. This was also the strategy that almost every top sect had for their disciples. The sect would only provide the most basic cultivation resources. If they wanted to improve, they had to rush about on their own. However, not everyone accepted the mission and went out to travel. There were also those who stayed in the dome to participate in the inner and outer sword sparring. I think this is a choice that everyone will face. We chose to go out, but some of us chose to stay and fight with the inner sword. One of the swordsmen said unhappily, "There's no difference between the two, right? Although I heard that the battle with the inner sword is very cruel, there is no danger to one's life. However, when we go out, we walk the line between life and death. As far as I know, among this group of brothers who went out, there were quite a few who met with misfortune. From the looks of it, going out requires even greater courage." What he said was both right and wrong. Fighting with the inner sword in the realm of 9 palaces did not put one's life in danger, but the cruel psychological impact was certain. However, if one chose to travel outside and chose to fly at a low altitude or even crawl on the ground, there would be no danger at all. Of all the people present, who would dare to pat their chest and say that they were flying freely in the sky? The swordsman nodded. I didn't say that there was a difference between the two. What I want to say is that something happened in the inner and outer sword sparring this time. In the realm of 9 palaces, where nothing happened for tens of thousands of years, someone actually died. Moreover, it was an inner swordsman. This news was not shocking, and it had been spread around for a long time. However, swordsmen were not very talkative, so most of the cultivators who had just returned from their travels heard about it for the first time. They could not help but perk up their ears. Of course, I won't spread the details, but what I want to say is that luck is a strange thing. It is precisely because nothing happened in the realm of 9 palaces for tens of thousands of years that when people came out, they guessed that the inner and outer sword sparring this time was inauspicious. The most thought-provoking thing was that the series of deaths that followed seemed to prove this point. Seeing that he had attracted everyone's attention, the cultivator smiled mysteriously. 2 years ago, Outer Sword senior brother Yenhu returned home to visit his family. He was ambushed in the southeast region and died. He was one of the outer swordsmen who participated in the inner and outer sword sparring. A year and a half ago, Inner Sword senior brother Yenming went missing while he was exploring a secret from a soul lamp in the Sword Spirit Hall. It seems that he has met with misfortune. He was also one of the inner swordsmen who participated in the inner and outer sword sparring. A year ago, Outer Sword senior brother Yinsha got into a conflict with someone while he was out on a mission. He was defeated and died, and the murderer is still unknown. He was also one of the participants. Say, don't you think it's strange that 3 of them left in 3 years, and they were all on the list of those who entered the realm of 9 palaces? It's as if they were tainted with evil. Another older swordsman laughed. Junior brother. Every year, you can find countless versions of this rumor in the dome. Do you know how many swordsmen Xinyuan lost last year? 109. How much did they lose in 3 years? More than 300. Don't you think it's too arbitrary to use the deaths of 3 of them to prove that there's some mysterious evil? These numbers can't prove the truth at all. According to your way of thinking, I can name a few places that are even more evil. After all, there are more than 300 cultivators who died. How can we find something in common with them? For example, they all went to a certain place, carried out a certain mission, or had a certain background. For example, you don't know, right? Among the 100 or so swordsmen who died last year, more than half of them were born in the 5th ring. Then, can we say that last year was a disaster year for the natives of the 5th ring? Everyone laughed out loud. That was true. More than 300 people had left in 3 years. But using 3 of them as coincidences was indeed a bit far-fetched. If they were to use this method, they would be able to accumulate countless so-called coincidences. That cultivator was still unconvinced. Senior brother. Then why did the visitation hall seal the dossier and not allow others to access the list of those who participated in the inner and outer sword sparring? Isn't it to protect these people? That senior brother laughed. Of course, it's to protect them, but it's not the kind of protection you think it is. It's because of the inner sword who died in the Nine Palace realm. Why didn't he save him? Jiuling Jun was only in charge of safety and would not participate in the sword sparring. The inner sword must have been injured by someone from the same sect. Perhaps it was a vicious attack, and Jiuling Jun was unable to save him. The sect didn't release the list to protect these participants from the inner sword's revenge. Think about it. Who else could be so vicious other than the outer sword's lineage? If the list was leaked, it would bring endless trouble. So it was kept a secret. Another swordsman interjected. It might not be the work of an outer sword, right? From what I know, that inner sword was quite famous among the newcomers. His strength was something to be proud of. Who could beat him to the point where Jiuling Jun couldn't save him? From what I see, it's because of the inner sword's infighting that could have caused such a situation. Come. Let's talk about happy things. It's not easy for us to gather, so why bring up such depressing topics? Chapter 258. Lu Xiaoyi listened thoughtfully in a remote corner of the crowd. In his opinion, there really might be something fishy about this, but he couldn't figure it out until a gentle voice came from behind him. Senior brother Lu, are you pretending to be a little white rabbit? Lu Xiaoyi turned around and saw a pretty face with a faint smile. It was one of the 4 female cultivators who came with him, Qin Erong. He didn't have any interactions with this woman, and they didn't speak at the gathering more than 10 years ago. He didn't know that this woman looked delicate and cute, and her words were sweet and soft. Why was there a hidden meaning in her words? What did she mean by pretending to be a little white rabbit? He was a little white rabbit, all right? Junior sister Qin, your sudden appearance gave senior brother a fright. I wonder what junior sister means by coming here. I'm stupid, so I don't understand. Qin Erong walked to his side and stood side by side. Although her eyes were looking at the center of the discussion, her words were directed at Lu Xiaoyi alone. Senior brother, you're pretending again. All right, since senior brother doesn't want to show your true face, I'll throw a brick to attract jade. I come from the lower head planet, the same realm as Chao Wendao. Senior brother, you can't have forgotten about Chao Wendao, right? Lu Xiaoyi's eyelids twitched. That I seem to have some impression. Qin Erong smiled. And in Min province, one was Sheng Yi, the other was Ming Mu. Senior brother, have you forgotten? They also came from the lower head planet and had friendly relations with Chao Wendao. In the end, one of them really died, while the other died with his eyes wide open. Also, senior brother also participated in the internal and external sword fight 3 years ago, right? Although everyone present was dismissive of it, everyone knew in their hearts that those who dared to fight with the internal sword were all outstanding figures of the external sword. Lu Xiaoyi knew that he couldn't continue pretending. This woman obviously investigated him, but he didn't know what she meant by doing so. He wasn't a spy from another sect, so why would he be afraid of being exposed? He just didn't want to be too high profile. He sighed. Junior Marshall's sister is also from a lower head star like them. Are you speaking up for them? Qin Erong shook her head. You want to seek justice for them just because they're from the same realm? Lower head star's population is over 100 million. How can I get them all? There would always be discord. Not to mention coming from the same domain, even if they were from the same sect or clan, how could there be a monolithic block of iron? I'm not familiar with them, so this has nothing to do with me. Lu Xiaoyi was a little puzzled. Then, what's the point of junior sister coming here today? Isn't it better for cultivators to keep some things in their hearts? Qin Erong smiled bitterly. Yes, cultivators should be shrewd and patient. They should only speak when they really need it. But if I really do speak up at that time, I'm afraid there will only be a transaction and no friendship. Lu Xiaoyi was silent. That's right. She would only speak when she really needed him. His impression of this woman was that she was a scheming woman. So now, this woman's thoughts were no longer deep? It's difficult to be a cultivator. There are countless obstacles. It's even more difficult to be a female cultivator. There are even more countless troubles. For example, these self-righteous men who think that becoming Dao companions is giving you a chance. They never think about whether we really need it. Since the day the dual cultivation method was invented, in the history of dual cultivation method, would it really fair for both sides? Everyone understood it, but no one said it. Lu Xiaoyi was embarrassed. Qin Erong understood it very well. He was indeed an outstanding figure who could build the Tao Foundation in a small star zone. His wisdom alone made him feel like he was the only one who was sober when everyone else was drunk. Well, it actually makes sense. Junior sister, you have a deep vision. You're different from others. Qin Erong said self-mockingly. I'm not the only one who has a deep vision. Instead, every female cultivator could see that all of this was just an act. Everyone has their own path and different choices. Little Butterfly is an inner sword cultivator with a bright future. She is also rarely disturbed in the line of inner sword. She has talent. Little Luo has a persevering temperament. Among us, he is the most hardworking and has the highest achievements. He wants to deal with the difficulties of the cultivation world by himself. Kai Ling is on the path of seducing people with her beauty. It's not an evil path. She just goes with the flow. She hopes to find a Tao companion who could be of great help to her in terms of resources. As for me, I don't have Little Butterfly's talent, Little Luo's perseverance, and Kai Ling's openness. But I have my own advantages. I like to observe people. Lu Xiaoyi rubbed his nose. Sure enough, no one who could build the Tao Foundation was simple, especially in the outer zone where the spiritual vigor of heaven and earth was thin. Especially the women here. If they were not special, how could they come here? Ho ho! What else could he say? Say that he was a non-observant object? Qin Erong said seriously. Although I'm a little scheming to say these things to you now, at least I can leave some feelings for you. If I ask you when I have something to do, I'm afraid there will only be a barefaced deal left. I still want to leave some feelings for you. I also know that you have countless troubles yourself. Who can take care of how much for each other? I'm just thinking that if there comes a day when I can't take it anymore and need help, please don't refuse my occasional help. What I actually like the most is a barefaced deal. Lu Xiaoyi shouted in his heart. The art of verbal communication was brought to the extreme by Qin Erong. She was very smart. She discovered the uniqueness of this little fellow who came with her from the same batch as her from the clues. He gradually revealed his loftiness without saying anything. When they went out on missions, they only dared to travel in groups. Although they said they were going around the 5 rings, the places they went were actually very limited. They didn't really dare to swagger around. Flying at low altitudes took up most of their time. Unlike this senior brother, who had only joined the sect for 3 years, he dared to go out on his own. Moreover, he could kill strong enemies consecutively. Those were the disciples of the Supreme Sect and the Myriad View Sect. They were existences on the same level as Xianyuan. They weren't some Tom, Dick, or Harry from small sects. As a woman, she was still somewhat special in some aspects. For example, in order to please her, a certain senior brother who had a position in the sect would occasionally show off his extensive knowledge, coupled with the fact that he could easily kill Chao Wendao, who was somewhat famous in the lower world, before he joined the sect and dared to participate in the cruel internal and external sword competition. The portrait of this senior brother gradually became vivid and lifelike. Even if he was smiling like a little white flower hidden in the crowd right now, she needed to establish a relationship with this kind of person. At the very least, she couldn't break off contact with him. This had nothing to do with whether or not they could become Tao companions. Qin Erong didn't have such thoughts. Moreover, she also knew that she could see this senior brother's attitude in this regard just by looking at his behavior when he was not in the circle of female cultivators. This was a person with great ambitions. She was very accurate about this. Chapter 259. Lu Xiaoyi was unable to reject her. No one would be able to reject her. She did not ask him to do anything now. She only hinted at the future and was purely trying to befriend him. She was from the same hometown, and she was also a woman. She looked harmless. He was actually very afraid of this kind of woman. He felt that this kind of woman was much more difficult to deal with than Gong Xiaodai, who was a little abnormal and narcissistic. Just as he was feeling depressed, 4 sword lights flew from the sky. Judging from the way they flew, there was 1 outer sword and 3 inner sword. Some cultivators immediately expressed their dissatisfaction. These inner sword trash want to join in the fun. They don't have much resources in the first place, but they still want to join in the fun. The 4 people immediately arrived. The outer sword leading the way was a little embarrassed. No one would give him a good face if he led a wolf into a flock of sheep. However, the relationship between the inner and outer swords of Xianyuan sword sect was no longer as incompatible as before. It was not the main conflict. It was normal for the inner sword to have outer sword friends and outer sword friends to have inner sword friends. Needless to say, they were brought to this occasion with the intention of getting to know Dao companions. Of course, they would not show it so obviously. They all had their own status and rules. Qin Erong explained, "The 3 people who came are Yin Bo, Yin Miao, and Yin Chong of the inner sword. They came for senior sister Kai Ling. They have a fixed goal and are here to declare their sovereignty." Lu Xiaoyi was very curious. 3 people for one? Qin Erong covered her mouth and laughed. "Senior brother, you have so many complicated thoughts. It's not as bad as you think. Senior sister Kai Ling originally knew an outstanding inner sword person called Yin Yun. Unfortunately, he died in the 9 Palaces world. This Yin Miao is Yin Yun's junior brother. You should know senior sister from there. When senior brother is gone, it's possible for the junior brother to inherit his will. As for the other 2, one is a junior like us, and the other is an old swordsman. They should be here to help senior brother." Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. Can will be inherited like this? This junior sister Kai Ling was also a capable person. She could attract so many inner swords. They all had their own ways of living. He knew 2 of them. It was Yin Chong of the 3 inner swords. It was the first inner sword he met in the realm of 9 Palaces, the one who was tortured to death by him. However, he didn't know his name at that time. Only now could he match the name to the person. As for the old swordsman, wasn't he the one who had teamed up with him outside of Halua City? A very cocky person with eyes on his forehead. So his name was Yin Bo. The gathering continued, but with the addition of the 3 internal swordsmen, the topic was more focused on the differences between internal and external swordsmanship. As a swordsman, how could it be satisfying to talk about swordsmanship? Of course, he had to test his skills, especially Smoke Wave, who was the leader. He had to show everyone that he was different from the rest. Of course, he gladly agreed. Fortunately, everyone knew their limits and stopped after a certain amount of fighting, so they didn't really get into a fight. Smoke Wave was most happy to show that the inner swords and outer swords were a family. He was the senior here, so even if he was annoyed, he had to take the lead. The other 2 inner swords were more reserved. Yin Miao was still all right as he had participated a few times. Only Yin Chong didn't say a word, but his eyes kept glancing at Lu Xiaoyi. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. He knew that Yin Chong was waiting for an opportunity to take revenge on him in the realm of 9 Palaces. He was now hesitating, considering whether this was a suitable occasion. It was his habit to not let others control the situation. He would rather take the initiative. Thus, he apologized to Qin Erong and walked towards Yin Chong without leaving a trace. In Qin Erong's eyes, this was especially meaningful. She knew that these 2 had participated in the competition between internal and external swords. Looking at the situation, it was obvious that these 2 had met in the realm of 9 Palaces. Although the winner and the loser wasn't announced, it was obvious from the situation they were in. This senior brother Lu had hidden very well. Lu Xiaoyi came in front of Yin Chong, who was on guard. The good thing was because of his identity as an inner sword, there weren't many people around him. "Junior brother Yin Chong? I'm your senior brother Yin Chong." Lu Xiaoyi had an affectionate expression on his face. This was for the others to hear, but the following conversation was what he really wanted to say. "Yin Chong, you must be thinking of using this opportunity to settle the grudge in the realm of 9 Palaces. The problem is this the right occasion? I think that private matters should be settled privately. It's not like you're acting like a monkey for others to see. In this kind of situation, if you lose, you'll be even more embarrassed. If you win, I might expose your performance in the realm of 9 palaces if I'm unhappy. Why bother? If you want to test what you've learned in the past 3 years, you can come to my cave residence. We can compare notes privately, and we can do whatever we want without being influenced by other people's opinions. Isn't that perfect? I don't need to care about your inner sword face and show mercy to you. What do you say? Yin Chang raised his eyebrows. Although he knew that this person was trying to provoke him, he couldn't back down. Well, after this gathering, you and I will find a remote place to have a big fight. You don't need to show mercy. My inner sword lineage can afford to lose to those weird words. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. It's a deal. Without saying anything more, he retreated. Qin Erong, who was beside him, couldn't help but say, "Senior brother." Lu Xiaoyi had no choice. This woman was really troublesome. Yes, we agreed to have a drink after the gathering. That's it. Qin Erong was very excited. Do you need someone to pour wine for you? Lu Xiaoyi's face became serious. He didn't believe that this intelligent woman didn't understand what he meant by drinking wine. Therefore, no. You know that when men drink, the most taboo thing is to have women accompanying them. When the time comes, who can drink more and who can drink less? It's originally a simple matter, but it may become complicated. You know, women watching is the source of disaster. Qin Erong certainly understood that this was a battle between the two of them. It wasn't a situation where they stopped at a certain point. They would have to show their real skills. Senior brother, will something happen? Do you need an elder to watch over you? Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. There will only be danger when you meet your match. If it's just guidance, how can there be danger? This wasn't boasting, but a kind of confidence that came from the bottom of his heart. He didn't know how much progress Yin Chang had made in the past 3 years, but no matter how great his progress was, it couldn't be compared to Lu Xiaoyi's rapid progress in swordsmanship. Back then, the 4 Seasons wasn't a real flying sword, but now it was. At the end of the gathering, both the guests and the host enjoyed themselves. This was a very ordinary gathering at the Dome. It happened every day. Swordsmen from different circles learned, made friends, and expanded their network through this kind of method. Lu Xiaoyi said goodbye to Ling Ruofeng and Qin Erong and returned to the cave residence. He could clearly feel that there was a figure following him closely behind. His divine sense was flickering in and out of existence. He couldn't help but laugh. This ability was far inferior to that stinky Yin Bo who was in charge of protecting him when he returned from Minzhou Prefecture. After such a long time, he didn't see that senior brother come over to talk to him. He didn't know if he saw him. He owed him a favor. Chapter 260. When they were still some distance away from the cave, Lu Xiaoyi stopped in the air above the frozen river. He was very familiar with the surroundings. There were no other cave dwellings within a radius of 100 miles. For 2 Foundation establishment cultivators, this was more than enough space for a fight. This time, he did not take the initiative. Instead, he waited passively for his opponent to come within 350 feet of him before allowing his opponent to attack first. He also wanted to know if his defense was effective within the range of the inner sword. In the 9 Palaces realm, he had never come into direct contact with either Yin Chang or Yin Yin. This was because he thought that this kind of battle was uncontrollable for him. At that time, Yin Yun sword frequency had reached 10 swords per breath. Yin Chang was obviously weaker, only reaching the standard of 5 or 6 swords. This was not a matter of talent, but a lack of practice. When comparing a 10-year-old swordsman to a 10-year-old swordsman, the difference in sword frequency, which could only be improved through practice, was understandable. Even with just the 4 seasons, he could still achieve an impenetrable defense. The 2 figures chased back and forth on the frozen river. Lu Xiaoyi only defended and did not attack. He allowed Yin Chang to attack as much as he liked. During this process, he observed the changes in battle tactics of the inner sword and flying sword. He was slightly disappointed. Perhaps it was because he had not practiced swordsmanship for long. Yin Chang's battle tactics were very limited. He could use shadow sword, sword explosion technique, as well as a few different attribute transformations on his flying sword. However, under the absolute suppression of the Four Seasons, these things could not gain any advantage at all. A battle between a spell cultivator and a swordsman would present very exciting changes in battle techniques. It was a collision between two great systems, exploring the unknown, moving around in traps, and battling heart and strength. However, a battle between two swordsmen would often be very boring. This was because the difference in the quality of the flying sword would often determine the direction of the battle. If Lu Xiaoyi's Four Seasons did not give birth to a sword spirit, it would be very difficult for his sword control to reach the level of intercepting 5 or 6 swords in a breath. If he couldn't intercept all of the swords, he could only use evasion techniques or control a second flying sword. This greatly limited his ability to counterattack. But now, the flying sword controlled by a sword spirit could easily intercept all of his opponent's flying swords. Moreover, it was much stronger and completely suppressed his opponent in terms of distance. This kind of battle lost its suspense. The swordsman was completely suppressed by his flying dagger, and it would be extremely difficult for him to rely on any other means to fight back. Yin Chang also wanted to get closer to solve the problem, but Lu Xiaoyi also let him in. After several dozen breaths of time, he had no effect on the sword and could only dejectedly leave. He was a bit desperate. Initially, he thought that after years of hard work, his sword speed and sword frequency had reached new heights, and the only thing he was lacking was the distance he could control his sword. Yet, in a real battle, he felt that the disparity was even more apparent than before. He was not the kind of person who would beg for mercy. His skills were not as good as his opponents, so there was no point in continuing to struggle. Thus, he sheathed his sword and stood there, overshadowed. Lu Xiaoyi didn't say anything either. Only he could overcome this mental barrier by himself. No one else could persuade him otherwise. "You're asking to be humiliated. Sorry for disturbing you." Yin Chang left, leaving behind a cloud of dust. It was unknown whether he was courageous because of the humiliation or if he had sunk into depravity. This was something a cultivator had to experience in the process of cultivation. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. He didn't want it to be like this, but who could avoid it when he was in the middle of it? That included him. He had always been hesitant about whether or not he should use the last of his wealth, the 2 spiritual jades, to begin the re-engraving of the sword formation of the sword spirit of the 10-strike city. However, he was always reluctant to do so. But now he had thought it through. It wasn't because he was lamenting about Yin Chang's situation, but because he was worried about the supernatural issues discussed by the external swords. He always felt that this matter was inextricably linked to him. Although he still couldn't determine where the core of the matter was, there was a real sense of urgency that forced him to quicken his steps forward. Lu Xiaoyi was very clear about his position. He was indeed like a crane in a flock of chickens among these inner and outer swordsmen who had built their foundation for more than 10 years. However, he might not necessarily have no opponents among the cultivators who had joined the sect for more than 10 years and had a certain amount of experience. Even cultivators at Yin Yun's level were, strictly speaking, rookies. He couldn't forget that when he walked out of the dome, no one would divide him into those who had been in the sect for more than 10 years. Everyone only had one identity when they left the sect: foundation establishment. Those cultivators who had built their foundation for more than 50 years, or even more than 100 years, were the truly terrifying ones. Regardless of whether it was cultivation or experience, whether it was martial arts or techniques, they all had sufficient time to carefully polish themselves. He had to consider these risks and not think that he could always mingle in the circle of rookies. Because of his experience with the four-season sword spirit, he no longer rashly purchased large quantities of precious materials. Instead, he purchased small quantities and waited for the final choice of the Ju City sword spirit. The Ju City sword spirit was different from the four-season sword spirit. Its choice was 1 layer of speed sword formation and 2 layers of strength Ju City sword formation. After a month, the 10 strikes city sword technique which originally had 9 layers of sword formation, was carved to the 7th layer by the sword spirit and could no longer continue. The Four Seasons flying sword had 8 layers, and the Ju City sword formation had 7 layers. It sounded very strange, but Lu Xiaoyi knew that in the future, his flying sword formation no longer had much to do with the sword technique itself. What determined the number of flying sword formations was the strength of the sword spirit. And the strength of the sword spirit was closely related to his own cultivation and the time he spent communicating with the flying sword. His external sword technique had already gradually broken away from the trajectory of the Xianyuan sword sect that had lasted for tens of thousands of years, and was beginning to show a style that was completely unique to him. All of this could not be replicated, because no one could create a sword spirit like him. Although he had already found the general method of creating a sword spirit, he had no idea how this could create a sword spirit. He had once gone to the Boa Tower and flipped through countless records regarding the birth of sword spirits. But in the end, he could not find any precedent for the birth of a sword spirit. The birth of only one four-season sword spirit could be described as a coincidence. But the birth of a Ju City sword spirit showed that this was not a coincidence, but there must be some kind of internal law. Unfortunately, he knew nothing about it now. He now had 2 main flying swords. In terms of speed and agility, the four-season sword was faster. In terms of strength and penetration, the Ju City sword was more powerful. This allowed his battle tactics to be in a state of balance. As he had more and more flying sword in the future, there would be more battle tactics to choose from. Just from statistics, with 7 or 8 of these flying swords, the combinations that could be formed were almost endless. This was the true form of a swordsman in his heart. Unknowingly, he had gradually forgotten his dream of cultivating. In the life of a cultivator, there would always be this kind of helplessness. The dreams of youth were always so unrealistic. He wanted to be a scientist, he wanted to be a warrior, he wanted to be a guard at the border, he wanted to be a celebrity with countless fans. In the end, he was still in a small dark room, writing novels in his middle age. Chapter 261. While he was familiarizing himself with the 3 flying swords, another year had passed. Lu Xiaoyi's cultivation life was dull and regular. This was the advantage of being in a large sect. When you don't cause trouble, you can completely become invisible among tens of thousands of people. However, some people can never truly become invisible. A sword letter sent him to the visitation hall. It was from the Vice Hall Master, Gu Gang. Are there any problems with your recent cultivation? I see that you rarely come to Thousand Elegance Peak. You must know that swordsmen can't be cultivated behind closed doors. Our methods of cultivating qi are not as good as those famous Taoist sections. If you don't sharpen your sword heart through battle, your future achievements will be very difficult. Lu Xiaoyi accepted the advice seriously. He wasn't sure if Master Gu Gang knew that he had participated in the internal and external sword competition many years ago, but he couldn't ask. He could only pretend that he knew. There were tens of thousands of external sword cultivators in Xianyuan, and they could only rely on free-range methods. It was impossible to train them one-on-one unless you found a master who appreciated your aptitude. There were few internal sword cultivators, so it was relatively easy to find a master. However, there were too many external sword cultivators, so for most ordinary cultivators, it was normal to fumble around alone for a lifetime. Gu Gang looked at this silent disciple and felt that it was a pity. He was an elder who had been present when this person first entered the sect. He knew very well that this little guy was reluctant at the beginning and would rather learn the Tao than practice the swordsman. However, under the influence of Xuanyuan's environment, he had become a qualified swordsman. However, the sect was unfair to him in many aspects, and this was something that he was very dissatisfied with. The internal strife within the external sword sect was very strong, but he always believed that this kind of strife shouldn't affect the new disciples. They were still growing and had too much to learn. They shouldn't spend too much energy on meaningless internal strife. However, things didn't go according to one's wishes. Even if this disciple wasn't a frivolous person, there were still undeserved disasters that fell on his head. Moreover, they came from the upper echelons. This was the second time he had received an order to deal with this disciple. Of course, it wouldn't be so direct. Instead, it was contained in bits and pieces of the order. The first time was when this cigarette, but was rewarded after he killed 4 cultivators from the large sections. The reward was pitifully small, completely not in line with Xuanyuan's tradition. However, this kind of thing had never been explicitly stated, so he couldn't say anything. This was the second time. For this reason, he had specially communicated with the Ascending Hall Master, Senior Brother Gu He. As expected, Senior Brother Gu He avoided the topic as usual. Although he was very reluctant in his heart, there were some words that he had to say. There's a mission. It's about a small city in the far east of the domed sphere of influence. It's close to the west of the Wolf Ridge. They need someone from Xianyuan to guard that place. You also know that there are countless cities in the western regions. Not every city has a disciple from Xianyuan guarding it. Those cities that belong to other sects' sphere of influence, we also won't casually interfere. However, within the dome sphere of influence, especially some large cities or strategic points, Xianyuan can't ignore them and let them drift away from our line of sight. This small town is close to the Wolf Ridge. It's an important border town and has always been a place of conflict. The various powers are tangled and complicated. Guarding this place requires a certain amount of strength and experience. So you think I'm suitable? Lu Xiaoyi interjected abruptly. He already had a premonition of the trouble that was about to follow. His heart was dissatisfied, so he abruptly interrupted. Although he had never been to that place and didn't know its specific location, he was very clear about what kind of place the Wolf Ridge was on the map of the Western regions. The Wolf Ridge was the most majestic mountain range in the 5 rings. On average, it was 10,000 feet above sea level and stretched across tens of millions of miles. The narrowest part of the mountain range was still tens of thousands of miles wide. To mortals, it was an insurmountable moat. It was the same for Foundation establishment cultivators. Foundation establishment cultivators couldn't fly that high. It was also because of the existence of the Wolf Ridge that the 5 rings were divided into 3 large regions: the Western regions, the Southeastern regions, and the Air Sea region. In other words, the town that Gu Gang mentioned, after crossing the Wolf Ridge, was another large region, the Southeastern regions. This was the territory headed by Wushang. Due to the location of the Snow Dome Mountain of the Xianyuan sword faction, it actually didn't have much contact with the Wolf Ridge. But because of this, every town near the Wolf Ridge was guarded by swordsmen. The main purpose was to prevent other powers from infiltrating their territory. Guarding a place like this was much more difficult than guarding an inland city. The overall quality of the cultivators was very high. Not only did they need to have a certain amount of battle strength, they also needed to have enough emotional intelligence to deal with the entanglements of various powers. With Xianyuan as their backer, others wouldn't do anything in the open, but it was easy to dodge an open spear, but hard to defend against an arrow in the dark. Some dirty tricks were endless. The chances of the cultivators guarding this place getting into trouble were also much higher than in other places. Of course, the reward for the mission was also much higher. Lu Xiaoyi couldn't understand. This kind of mission had tens of thousands of Foundation establishment cultivators in the Snow Dome Mountain. Why was it given to him, a newbie who had only been in the sect for 15 years? It was very impolite to abruptly interrupt an elder's words, but Gu Gang could understand his feelings. If this mission was given to anyone who had been in the Foundation establishment realm for less than 50 years, they would also be dissatisfied. This was because that place was only suitable for old cultivators who had been in the Foundation establishment realm for more than 50 years. They had to have a deep enough cultivation and enough sword skills to choose from. In fact, before Lu Xiaoyi, the swordsman that was sent to guard this place was indeed an old swordsman who had been in the Snow Dome Mountain for more than 50 years. This is the responsibility of the external sword faction. Since the establishment of the Snow Dome sword faction, this has never changed. For tens of thousands of years, our external sword faction has never disappointed the faction. This is the glory of the external sword faction. Glory requires sacrifice. Lu Xiaoyi said indifferently. Gu Gang narrowed his eyes. You're not willing to sacrifice yourself for Xianyuan? Lu Xiaoyi sighed. I've been in the sect for 15 years. I've received free top-notch techniques, top-notch sword skills, and a considerable amount of resources every year. I know that these are not for free. I'll go, but it has nothing to do with sacrifice. There was nothing in this world that could make him sacrifice. Perhaps there was something in the past, but it was already slumbering in its original realm. Gu Gang sighed in his heart. Compared to the native sect and the old sect, these foreign cultivators were still incomparable in terms of loyalty and dedication. This was also the norm for low-level cultivators in Xianyuan. Only when these foreign cultivators had advanced to Jindan and Yuanying would they slowly become truly loyal to the sect. The last swordsman who guarded this place mysteriously disappeared. From his soul lamp, it seems that he's already dead. Considering that there are many people who are suitable for this mission, the sect has decided to draw lots. You're very unfortunate, but also very lucky. For a true swordsman, pressure and danger are often the motivation for their success. Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. You might as well have just said that you're sending me. Draw lots? Are you lying to a child? Chapter 262. Before Lu Xiaoyi left, Gu Gang said a few words with deep meaning. Young people, it's hard to avoid being a bit hot-blooded. But if you're hot-blooded, you need to know how to make up for it. In the cultivation world, it's hard to survive if you're blindly strong. It's not just Xianyuan, it's the same everywhere. Think about it carefully. Lu Xiaoyi was somewhat baffled. He could understand Gu Gang's meaning, which was that if he said or did something wrong, he had to lower his head and admit defeat. Otherwise, it would be very difficult for him to survive. But the problem was, he didn't feel like he had offended anyone. Speaking of which, when he entered the Xianyuan sword school, he did see a few high-level cultivators. Taoist Cheng, who guided him, was one, but there was almost no interaction. How many Taoists were there in the inner sword school? That's not very likely. Why would a rock care about the life and death of an ant? Then there was only one left, Taoist Wen Chong from when he first caught the sword pill. Could it be him? It didn't seem like it. Moreover, how could an inner sword Taoist reach so far into the sword chi rushing heaven pavilion? What was the truth behind it? He was too lazy to think about it. From the day he was taken to the fifth ring, he had no choice but to follow the rules of the cultivation world. Accurately speaking, from the moment he stepped into the cultivation world, he had to abide by the rules of the cultivation world, whether it was good or bad. Lu Xiaoyi's thinking was very simple. No matter how he came to be, he had obtained something in the Xianyuan sword school that he couldn't get anywhere else. It was only right for him to repay it. It was like a transaction. He didn't have any conflict with repaying the sect, but he did have a conflict with others treating him like a fool. Didn't Xianyuan advocate the spirit of martial arts? Shouldn't people fight to get into such a dangerous place? Why did it become drawing straws when it came to him? Lu Xiaoyi calmly walked out of the Ascension Hall. He didn't say anything soft, nor did he refute. Other than a few sarcastic questions, his temper was very swordsman. Gu Gang felt uncomfortable in his heart. He had been in the Ascension Hall for dozens of years, and it wasn't that he hadn't done things that went against his will. However, those were all things that happened for a reason, and it wasn't as inexplicable as this time. Thus, he once again sought out Hall Master Guhi, wanted to clarify things. Guhi sighed. This junior brother of his had such a temper. He was too serious. Take a look. This is a decree from the Soaring Heaven Pavilion. I'm just following orders. If you're still dissatisfied, you can go find the martial uncles of the Soaring Heaven Pavilion to reason with them. This was a red register, and it had a special meaning in the Ascension Hall. Normally, it was kept by the Hall Master, and no one else was allowed to look at it. However, Guhi and this junior brother of his had been friends for hundreds of years, and their relationship was very close, so there were not so many rules. In each of the top sects of the fifth ring, the existence of spies and spies had never been cut off, and there was no way to investigate. This was because excessively searching one's soul and searching one's memory might reveal some hidden traitors, but would also harm the majority of innocent people. The gains did not make up for the losses. This was also the method of all the top sections. They were confident that if these traitors continued to wander around the base level, they wouldn't be able to come into contact with any core secrets. If they had the opportunity to become a Jin Dan Yuanying, then they would naturally have a sense of belonging to the sect. If this kind of influence that lasted for hundreds or even thousands of years couldn't overcome the old feelings of a cultivator when he was a child, then there was no need for such a sect to exist. Even so, there were still sects that put in effort in this aspect. This was because even Foundation establishment cultivators had the opportunity to learn about the sect's big movements. It was always better than nothing. This was also one of the main sources of information that the sects gathered about the Fifth Ring. Of course, they were basically all cultivators with ordinary potential. How stupid would a sect be to send their geniuses to someone else to spy, and in the end become someone else's pillar of support instead of keeping them to nurture themselves? Among all the Foundation establishment cultivators, the Fifth Ring's local cultivators had the most traitors. This was because everyone was squeezed into the Fifth Ring, so it was easier for them to infiltrate each other. Next were cultivators from their old home, Blue Sky. The most unlikely were Foundation establishment cultivators from outside the realm. Plundering was full of uncertainty and random. There was simply no way to arrange it. Gu Gang flipped open the register. Among the few red names, he shockingly discovered Cigarette Butt's name. He couldn't help but laugh in anger. Cigarette Butt? Spy? A spy from the outer realms? A spy who entered the sect only thinking about becoming a spell cultivator and didn't conceal anything? A spy who continuously killed tens of thousands of Jing Lu cultivators? Gu Gang's reaction was within Gu He's expectations. To him, carrying out the Sword Chi Soaring Heaven Pavilion's orders was more important than anything else. Moreover, the red names now were not the same as before. There were too many things mixed in here. Personal things were used to achieve their goals through the operation of public tools. Go to Soaring Heaven Pavilion. The answer is there. Lu Xiaoyi once again entered the world of 9 palaces. Since he was going to leave, he had to say goodbye to Jiuling Jun and casually take all the chicken but he collected in a mortal town. This disciple has to go on a long trip. The time is uncertain. I specially came to say goodbye to Jiuling Jun. Thank you for providing the cultivation environment all these years. When this disciple returns one day, I will bring you good wine and food. After waiting quietly for a moment, he heard that there was no movement in the world of 9 palaces. He knew that Jiuling Jun might have fallen asleep, so he didn't say much and turned to leave. The world of 9 palaces was a very good place to practice swordsmanship, but there were always pros and cons. For swordsmanship, the fastest way to improve was to fight for life and death outside. Blindly practicing on one's own was not enough. What he didn't know was that a Jew was in a dilemma in his own space. He didn't know how to choose. In his heart, he secretly scolded this brat for not knowing what was good for him. Going out to blindly wander around without achieving his swordsmanship, he would suffer sooner or later. But after all, he had followed his master for thousands of years. He knew that the little eagle would eventually fly alone, so he tried his best to hold back and not say anything. He hoped that this brat could come back alive. He was just a realm spirit. Although he also had the ability to move freely, he couldn't move without the 5 wild beast limbs. In other words, the higher-ups of Xianyuan would be able to discover his movements immediately. As an existence that had stayed in the dome for tens of thousands of years, his movements would attract too much attention. This was something he didn't want to see. A Jew thought about it from left to right. She still felt that she should look at all of this from the perspective of a master. Just like its master from 10,000 years ago, who had turned the world upside down outside and attracted fire countless times. Didn't he still walk out? This was the cultivation process of humans. After all, it was different from a realm spirit like him. He could pull a cultivator into the world of 9 palaces from any place in the fifth ring, provided that the cultivator took the initiative to activate the coordinate divine consciousness. But was it really good to do this? A cultivator who knew that he would always have a way out, or a cultivator who knew that every battle could be the last battle? Which one was more beneficial to the growth of a cultivator? Aju decided to let go. He really let go. He didn't force it, nor did he deliberately guide it. He would let this brat choose his own path. Chapter 263. Lu Xiaoyi didn't have much to prepare. All his belongings were in his storage ring. Perhaps preparing more materials of the 5 elements and sword embryos would give him something to do when he was bored while guarding the town. However, he was limited by the fact that he didn't have much money, and the town was within Xuanyuan's sphere of influence. It wasn't too far away, and it wouldn't take too much time to make a trip back. Walking out of the cave, he saw a figure floating in the air. It was Gu Gang. He really went to the Sword Qi Rushing Heaven Pavilion, but as expected, he gained nothing. This was the reason why he came here. He had to make himself feel at ease. I have collected 3 years' worth of resources for you. This is already the maximum number of years I can withdraw. When you go there, don't forget to cultivate. Only cultivation is the foundation of your survival. A storage ring was thrown over. Lu Xiaoyi probed it with his spiritual sense. 300 top-grade spirit stones were neatly arranged. This was equivalent to 3,000 middle-grade spirit stones. 1,000 spirit stones a year, which was much more than the 200 spirit stones a year he stayed in the sect. This was the benefit of going out on dangerous missions. The risk was always proportional to the benefit. Thank you, Martial Uncle. I want to know if there is a limit to guarding a town like this? Gu Gang smiled bitterly. There is no specific rule. In the past, the Xianyuan sword cultivators who were sent to guard the cities were usually old and weak, with little hope of reaching the upper realm. Some of them stayed in the dome to take care of specific matters, just like your senior brother Gu Bei. Some of them were more willing to go out, because it was more beneficial for them to establish their own mortal families. Of course, the time to establish a family cannot be too short. Later, the sect acquiesced to their wishes and gave them as much time as possible instead of fixed 10 or 20 years. Lu Xiaoyi was startled. This was worse than he had imagined. Until they die of old age? Is this a punishment? For a foundation establishment cultivator who is 50 or 60 years old, this might be a blessing. But for a cultivator who is 40 or 50 years old, this was driving them out of the mainstream where the atmosphere of cultivation was the strongest. In 100 years, when one had the most potential, one would lose the support of the sect. This included various spiritual gatherings, the opportunity to be apprenticed to a master, the sparring between fellow disciples, various competitions, the most up-to-date information, the various secluded exploration teams, and so on. Although in theory, the resources allocated to the sect were not less, or even more, the loss of many things could not be compared to the loss of resources. Actually, Lu Xiaoyi did not care about other things, but he could not go to the Bo Ao Tower and immerse himself in the sea of books all the time. This was his greatest loss. However, Gu Gang did not directly answer his question. You still have many opportunities to leave that place. For example, the Upper Realm Jindan, large-scale rotation within the sect. Are there other people who are fond of that town? Make meritorious contributions. I will keep an eye out for you and inform you of possible opportunities. But you have to understand that in the next 10 or 20 years, it will be very difficult for you to have a chance. You have the right to return to the sect at any time. As long as the place you're guarding doesn't cause any trouble, these are all minor details. The sect won't force you in these aspects. You only need to remember one thing. Cultivation is the foundation. As long as you are outstanding enough, anything is possible. If you degrade yourself, then no one can help you. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. He now also knew that the order to transfer him did not come from the Ascension Hall, but from a higher level. The Ascension Hall was nothing more than a relay. It held great authority in the hearts of many low-level foundation establishment cultivators. But in reality, it was nothing more than countless branches of the sword Qi soar to the heavens tower. Gu Gang was a hall master with a sense of responsibility. Unfortunately, his realm was too low, and he could not do anything. Are all the cities under Xuanyuan's rule managed by the external swords? Didn't the internal swords say that wherever there is danger, they will be there? Now it seems that they don't live up to their name. Gu Gang smiled bitterly. You have too little contact with the internal swords, so you don't understand. They're indeed responsible, but generally, after an accident, you are lucky to be alive. If you die, they will avenge you. Their biggest characteristic is that they're not willing to lock themselves in a certain position because they prefer to come and go freely. Maybe they know that they have made too many enemies, so they are not willing to become fixed targets. Lu Xiaoyi always hit the nail on the head when looking at problems. Gu Gang said solemnly, don't underestimate the external swords, and don't think that the internal swords should naturally be superior to the external swords. This may be the truth of Xuanyuan for tens of thousands of years, but I believe that it will not always be like this. Lu Xiaoyi bade farewell and left. He only partially accepted Gu Gang's words. He did not think highly of the internal swords, but he would not think highly of the external swords either. The only thing he thought highly of was his own sword. With the external sword's current cultivation method, wanting to suppress the internal swords one day was harder than ascending to the heavens. He did not tell anyone about his trip this time. Of course, Lord Zhou was not human. This was his first trip out of the mountain after 12 years, and it had been a long time, so he did not feel anything in his heart. Along the way, he went on a scenic tour. Only when he encountered natural dangers did he use his cultivator's methods to leap over them. This was a relaxing trip, and he liked this kind of journey where there was no time limit. As for what to do when he reached his destination, he would think about it when he got there. From his point of view, the current Five Rings was not in a state of civil war. Everyone was living under the same framework. As long as you did not place too much importance on the name of Xuanyuan and protected it in everything, then things would not be too complicated. The worst thing was that everything was done in the name of Xuanyuan. The other orthodoxies were all different and had to submit. Overbearing methods would always attract the dissatisfaction of others, and that was how trouble would come. In the three large domains of the Five Rings, there was no weak domain. The western domain was led by Xuanyuan, the southeastern domain was led by Supreme, and the Uri domain was led by the Three Pure Ones. In terms of the distribution of territories, among the many top powers in the western domain, Xuanyuan's position leaned towards the center and the west. Their sphere of influence and the natural barrier of the three domains, Wolf Ridge, were very small. The ones that were really close to Wolf Ridge were Jialan and Wan Jinglu. The small area was in a relative sense. For the Wolf Ridge that stretched for millions of miles, a few 100,000 miles was indeed very small. However, for a foundation establishment cultivator, it was very big. If it was big, he could only move around the place he was guarding. It would be a time-consuming and laborious task to go to places that were further away. On the side of the western domain that was close to Wolf Ridge, there were countless big and small towns at the foot of the mountain. Countless ordinary people lived there. Of course, Xuanyuan could not leave cultivators to guard all the towns. If he did so, even if he sent out tens of thousands of foundation establishment cultivators from the dome, it would not be enough for the cities under Xuanyuan's control. Most of the places were maintained by the cultivators of the small sections. They followed Xuanyuan's orders and acted in unison in order to obtain opportunities for their own development. However, in some of the more important locations, Xuanyuan's swordsmen had to leave people behind. They had a common characteristic, and that was that the Wolf Ridge that they were close to was relatively narrow. It was more suitable for cultivators to travel back and forth. Of course, this was only suitable for the large number of foundation establishment cultivators. The Wolf Ridge was as narrow as 10,000 miles. It was not a minefield that ordinary people could cross. 4 Jindan cultivators, this kind of isolation was meaningless. Xinyuan had to use this kind of location as a basis for deploying cultivators. They needed to know the general situation of the foreign cultivators entering and leaving. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.